Well, Mike, I'm so
Yeah.
excited about Exodus 20. I'm glad that it's part 1 too, so we have in 10 parts on this one.
No, well, I know we're going to have at least 2, obviously, but probably it's going to take a while to get through the commandments. So I would say at least 3. We'll see, but I would think at least 3. Well, this one, obviously is going to be a preliminary episode, part 1. We're going to cover issues related to Exodus 20 and what we call the 10 Commandments. We won't actually get into any of the specific commandments on this one. And you think, well, how in the world, are there really that many questions? It's just the 10 Commandments. I mean, what's so complicated about that? Well, nothing's ever really that simple, in biblical studies. And again, I think you're going to see as we go through this, a lot of these questions are not just stuff that scholars, come up with or invent, but there are things that arise from the text. Just even the phrase 10 Commandments, we're going to learn that there's some controversy to that. So the one thing we should say up front is you're going to hear me use the word Decalogue as well. That is another way to refer to the 10 Commandments specifically, as they appear in Exodus 20 or in Deuteronomy. Again, so if you hear me using that word, that's what it means. It's just another way of referring to the 10 Commandments. So one of the things we need to sort of discuss out of the gate, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this, is the source critical debate. That this is the JEDP stuff again. And the reason I bring it up, I hope will become evident. Any scholar who holds to a mainstream view of the authorship of the Torah, the Pentateuch, the JEDP stuff, that the Torah is just a patchwork quilt of sources. Anyone who takes that view would see the laws of Exodus 20 and other places in the Torah, i.e. Deuteronomy, but also other places in Exodus. They're going to see all that as the result of authorship of varied sources from various time periods. JEDP, again, this approach to the Torah, the documentary hypothesis, is married to the history of religions school. That's an academic term again, which presumes an evolutionary development of Israelite religion from the primitive polytheism to the more enlightened, enlightened monotheism, which we've talked about other times on the show. Now, as an example of how this thinking affects the Decalogue, consider this trajectory. Since later prophets like Amos focus on ethics and social justice. I mean, Amos is famous for this. See what I did there? I rhymed, okay? But Amos, the book of Amos, any study of that, you're going to get into ethics and social justice because there's so much content in that book about that stuff. So since that's true, scholars would presume, if you take this evolutionary trajectory view of Israelite religion, they would presume that the principles of the 10 Commandments found somewhere in Amos, when Amos applies the 10 Commandments, that would suggest that the principles, the 10 Commandments themselves, come from the time of Amos. That's the 8th century BC, which is long after the period of Moses. The 8th century BC would coincide with, you might think this is circular reasoning, but this is just how people are going to think. The 8th century BC would coincide with the time, therefore, that the E document, because that's where Exodus 20 is supposedly from. That would coincide with when the E document was composed, from which major parts of the book of Exodus derives, again, hypothetically. Now, the essay on the 10 Commandments from the Anchor Bible Dictionary notes this. Just listen to this here. Many of the critical studies of the Decalogue took issue with the tradition of its Mosaic origins on the basis of a history of religion's approach to the content of the 10 Commandments. It was argued, for example, that the social ethic expressed in the Decalogue is under the influence of the 8th century prophets, Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, Micah, and that the first commandment, having no other gods before me, was unthinkable prior to the time of Hosea. The Mosaic origins of the 10 Commandments were therefore questioned on the basis of a developmental theory with regard to Israel's religion and ethics. That's the end of the quote. So again, I'm not creating a caricature here of critical approaches to the 10 Commandments. There it is. That's Anchor Bible Dictionary. This is the way that this is thought about. Now, this isn't a graduate Hebrew course, so we're not going to get bogged down in source critical theory here. I'm more interested in the text as we have it, not hypothesizing about where all the parts came from and when they were created. Because I do think, as I've said many times before, I do think a lot of that is circular reasoning. So what we're going to do is look at issues that are apparent from the text as received. And we're going to start with the placement of the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, in the book of Exodus. I'm going to read an excerpt here from the Dictionary of the Old Testament Pentateuch volume as follows. In Exodus 20, where God gives the law at Sinai, the Decalogue is situated at the beginning of the book of the covenant. Let me just stop there. The book of the covenant, quote unquote, that's not a reference to the whole book of Exodus. The book of the covenant is a reference to all of the portions of Exodus that are concerned with laws, crimes, punishment, ethics. Exodus 20 is going to start that, but then it's what we read in the Ten Commandments is going to get expanded elsewhere in the book of Exodus. So that's what the book of the covenant means. Okay, so back to the quote. So the Decalogue is at the beginning of the book of the covenant. Source and redaction critics, redaction is a word that means editing. Source and redaction critics have argued that the Decalogue interrupts the flow of material between Exodus 19 and chapter 20, verse 18. Now, I want you to think about that. If you read, let me just stop here. If you read Exodus 19, beginning in Exodus 19, all the way through the end of 20, and then on into 21 and 22 and so on and so forth, it does feel interruptive. The first 17 verses of Exodus 20, if you go back into chapter 19, for instance, you've got the scene at Sinai there about, the Lord said, come up bringing Aaron with you. Don't let the priests and people break through to come up here. And then all of a sudden, we've got the Ten Commandments. Well, what happened in the rest of the scene? It feels interruptive, is the point. Now back to the quote. So if you take the Decalogue out, with the Decalogue removed, if you actually just plucked it right out of your Bible, the remaining material after, the Decalogue describes a theophany in which God instructs Moses to set limits around the holy mountain, with only Moses and Aaron allowed to ascend the mountain. The people, frightened by the thunderous theophany, request that Moses be their intermediary so that they will not die from standing in God's overwhelming presence. Now, let me just stop there. Here's Exodus 20, verse 18, right after the commandments end. Now, when all the people saw the thunder and flashes of lightning and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoke, the people were afraid and trembled and said to Moses, "You speak to us, we will listen. Don't let God speak to us, lest we die." Blah. So it just seems like the commandments should sort of come after all the mountain scene setting. Because when you get to Exodus 20, verse 22, we get more laws. There are laws about altars, for instance. Like why do we have, critics, source critics would say, why in the world are the first 17 verses, the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, why is it plopped down sort of right in the middle of this mountain scene? And then the mountain scene resumes before we get to other laws. Wouldn't it have made more sense to just put all the laws together, beginning with the Ten Commandments? And so when they see that raises questions about, well, maybe what we have here is just a material from a couple of sources that somebody just put together and probably could have been put together more smoothly, but it's evidence, again, of this patchwork kind of thing going on. So, again, we're talking about the placement now. We're not going to get into source critical theory and all that stuff. But this is worth thinking about. And I would suggest, and other people have had this suggestion who are not concerned about source critics and source criticism. What are the original sources of all this? Okay. People who approach the Bible in literary terms propose something different. They would say, okay, the placement of the Decalogue in Exodus 20 is, indeed interruptive, but that doesn't prove any part of chapters 19 or 20 come from different sources and time periods. There may be, and again, various scholars have proposed there is, a literary or structural reason for the ordering of the material as we have it. There may be some other reason rather than sources. There may be some literary design going on here, something intentional. Now, Durham, in his Word Biblical Commentary, comments on this, and I want to highlight a couple of observations he makes. So here's the quote from Durham. He says, "In some ways, the single most important point about the canonical form of the Decalogue is not what this section contains, but its location. The commandments are given as an integral part of the Sinai narrative sequence and as an essential segment of the account of Yahweh's presentation of himself to Israel within that sequence. Some literary critics indeed have even suggested that the relocation of the Decalogue is an uneasy insertion disruptive of the narrative sequence of which it is now a part. Such suggestions, he says, are mistaken, however, not alone for the violence they do to an Exodus, and again, that's the book of Exodus, carefully planned and arranged, for very definite reasons, into the form in which we have received it. The Ten Commandments must first of all be seen as Exodus, the book of Exodus, presents them. Words addressed by Yahweh himself to Israel, gathered by his command at the perimeter of holiness about the base of Mount Sinai. They form an essential part of Israel's experience of Yahweh's advent, and to detach them from the narrative preceding and following them compromises our understanding of both that narrative and the commandments themselves. With such a point clearly in mind, better consideration can be given to the form of the Decalogue, especially the question whether that form may have been dictated in part by the original purpose of the commandments and in part by continuing application of the principles set forth by them to life lived out in Israel in covenant with Yahweh. At least 5 aspects of the form the Decalogue has taken, and by form he means the order of the commands themselves and also, again, where they're situated in the book. He says about 5 aspects of the form of the Decalogue has taken need to be considered. And now this is me speaking now, I'm going to only mention 2 here for the purpose of this episode. Here's one. Durham says we need to consider the ancient Near Eastern covenantal legal form to which the commandments are obviously related. In other words, well, maybe the book of Exodus is trying to intentionally to mimic the way ancient Near Eastern covenants were ordered in their content. And then secondly, we need to consider the connection between the commandments and other Old Testament covenant legal collections, in particular the book of the covenant at large, which is Exodus 20, verse 22, all the way really toward the end of chapter 23. So that's the end of the Durham quote, and what he's saying is, look, there are going to be discernible reasons why the stuff is where it is. If we just, if we don't flip out and say, oh, the editor, had no idea what he was doing, it's just haphazard, what a goofball, or if we just say, well, this is obviously from, independent sources, blah, 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 blah. And Durham's saying, you don't really need to draw those conclusions. Those are conclusions that overreach the data. Now, we'll be hitting on both of those ideas that Durham listed, the ancient Near Eastern covenantal form and then the bigger picture as we proceed. But for now, just note that the interruptive feel and sequence of the Decalogue may be due to Exodus 19 and 20, really even beyond that. That material following ancient Near Eastern covenantal forms and elements. Second topic we want to say something about. Are the 10 Commandments the actual or original 10 Commandments? You say, what kind of a crazy question is that? It sounds odd, but the question arises for 2 reasons. First, the Hebrew phrase from which 10 Commandments as a term derives does not occur in Exodus 20. It actually occurs later in Exodus 34, verse 28. Let me read you verses 27 and 28. And the Lord said to Moses, write these words, for in accordance with these words I have made a covenant with you and with Israel. So he was there with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights. He neither ate bread nor drank water, and he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the 10 words, or in the ESV, the 10 commandments. That's Exodus 34, 27, and 28. So it's not until Exodus 34 that we actually get the Hebrew phrase, Aseret HaDevarim, the 10 words. And so, people look at that, well, why wouldn't that occur when the list is actually given? That's kind of odd. The phrase, again, the Hebrew phrase also occurs in Deuteronomy 4:13 and Deuteronomy 10:4. But again, does not appear at all in Exodus 20. Now, Nahum Sarna, we've been, quoting his Exodus commentary, periodically through the series. He writes this. He says, the present chapter, Exodus 20, carries no designation for this document, the Decalogue. The popular English title, The Ten Commandments, is derived from the traditional, although inaccurate, English rendering of the Hebrew phrase Aseret HaDevarim that appears in Exodus 34:28 and in Deuteronomy 4:13 and 10:4. In fact, the term commandment, which is Hebrew mitzvah, the plural is mitzvot, is not employed in the present context. In other words, that word doesn't occur in Exodus 20. The Hebrew means rather the 10 words, which the Jews of ancient Alexandria and Egypt translated literally into Greek as Decalogoi. This gave rise to the more accurate English alternative, Decalogue. So Decalogue actually means 10 words. It doesn't mean 10 commandments, because the Hebrew word for commandment is an entirely different word than we get in Exodus 34 and Deuteronomy 4, Deuteronomy 10. And then Sarna adds, in fact, traditional, this is Jewish exegesis, derived 13, not 10 commandments from what we know as the Decalogue. We're going to get into this. It depends on how you group certain statements in Exodus 20 verses 1 through 17. Again, that's where we get the quote-unquote 10 commandments, all right? It depends on how you group certain statements, whether you come out with 10 or in the case of ancient Jewish exegesis, 13. And even in the Christian tradition, Protestant and Catholic, this is an issue. We have 10 commandments, but how are they worded? So Christian tradition will settle on 10, but depending on what you group with what and what you separate, the wording is going to be different. Now, the InterVarsity Press, again, that dictionary, the Old Testament Pentateuch, I'm going to refer to what it says here because it's useful. The Decalogue in Exodus appears to be given a second time in chapter 34. So when you get the 10 words in Exodus 34, there's a lot of overlap between that and Exodus 20. Back to the quote. When Moses discovers that the Israelites began worshiping the golden calf in his absence, he angrily breaks the tablets containing the laws. Moses then ascends Sinai yet again, where God gives a set of replacement tablets. Though Exodus 34:28 says that God, quote, wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the 10 commandments, unquote, the commands given in Exodus 34 are clearly different from the ones recorded in Exodus 20. This is me now. They do not precisely overlap. There's new material in Exodus 34, and Exodus 34 is the one that actually refers to the 10 words. The prohibition against idols and the call to Sabbath rest do appear in Exodus 34, but the remaining stipulations pertain to religious festivals and sacrifices. That material about festivals and sacrifices is included in Exodus 34, and those are the 10 words. Back to the quote again. The Decalogue occurs yet another time in Deuteronomy 5, where its form and content are comparable to the material in Exodus 20. A book of speeches, Deuteronomy, has a sermonic exhortative quality. Here the Decalogue is incorporated into hortatory, that's exhortational, material by Moses that reminds Israel of its covenantal identity and responsibility in preparation for entering Canaan. Deuteronomy recalls the giving of these laws at Mount Horeb, a more general name for the locale rather than Mount Sinai, the more specific name for the mountain. Apart from that difference of name for the holy mountain, distinct differences between the Exodus version and the Deuteronomy version of the Decalogue are minimal. The commandment to observe a Sabbath rest in Exodus is based on God's divine rest on the seventh day. In Deuteronomy, the motivation for a Sabbath rest is Israel's memory of its enslavement in Egypt. So that's the end of the quotation. It actually gives you an example there of how the laws in Exodus, the commandments in Exodus and Deuteronomy are different. The motivation for the Sabbath rest is different in both accounts, okay? Now, is there a discernible reason for these differences and the repetitions of the Decalogue in these, in Exodus and Deuteronomy? And, Exodus 34 as well. Well, most would say, yeah, there is. I'm going to limit this to the repetition in Exodus 34. We'll hit later in part 2, and maybe we'll even have a part 3, as I said at the beginning. We'll hit differences between Exodus and Deuteronomy in the Decalogue when we get to the individual commandments. Now, Durham writes as follows about Exodus 34 and this whole issue. Exodus 34, 10 to 28 has been woven with some care into the larger narrative whole that is now Exodus 32 through 34, with the express purpose of suggesting the renewal of the covenant relationship between Yahweh and Israel. This section has been pieced together from material taken from several areas of interest. For example, covenant renewal, the avoidance of syncretistic influence, Yahweh the jealous God, gifts and sacred festivals due to Yahweh. Now, so it's been taken from material from several areas of interest in order to present an overall impression of covenant renewal that, number one, emphasizes complete loyalty to Yahweh, and this is a deliberate contrast to the terrible sin with the calf. So it emphasizes complete loyalty to Yahweh, whose justified jealousy is stressed as a warning against the temptation of a divided loyalty. And number two, summarizing in a deliberate mingling of themes from the Ten Commandments in what is now called the Book of the Covenant, earlier in Exodus, or more fully in Exodus, let's put it that way, an array of requirements directed against exactly the kind of disobedience the sin with the golden calf presented. So that's the end of the quote. So in other words, Durham is saying, look, some of the differences in Exodus 34 are very obviously due to the incident of the golden calf, which occurred while Moses, was up getting the commandments. And so when we have to do the commandments the second time around, there are going to be some alterations to reflect this incident and reflect God's attitude toward it. And so he's saying that's why you're going to get these differences between Exodus 20 and Exodus 34. It's what happens in between. Fair enough. And again, when we get to the individual commands, we'll talk about why there are differences between Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5 in the actual commands. But we're going to move on, for sake of this episode, to a third consideration, the number of the commands. We just brought this up a few moments ago, so let's drill down a little bit on it. Are there 10 or more than 10? Now, I'm going to share something here that I wrote for Bible Study Magazine. And on the episode page for this website, you're actually going to see this in chart form. Okay, so there'll be a link there to a visualization of what I'm going to say here. But this is from Bible Study Magazine, which again is pitched, for the average, churchgoer. So there's not going to be a whole lot of detail here, but I think it sort of captures the issue here. It seems to go without saying that the list of the Ten Commandments is something that Judaism and Christianity have always agreed upon. Well, that's not exactly true. Historically speaking, Jews and Christians, and even denominations within Christianity, have disagreed on exactly how the Ten Commandments should be listed and expressed. In fact, how to precisely spell out the commandments was an issue of considerable importance during the Protestant Reformation. The difference concerns how many commands are to be found in the first 6 verses and then the last 2 verses of Exodus 20, verses 2 through 17, which is the initial listing of the commandments received by Moses at Sinai. Again, the chart, this is me breaking in here, the chart that, again, we're going to have linked on the episode webpage, illustrates those disagreements. So back to my Bible Study Magazine portion. Interestingly, the Jewish tradition treats the statement in Exodus 20, verse 2, and you could compare Deuteronomy 5, verse 6, as a command when the wording has no imperative force to it at all. Exodus 22, I'll read it. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Well, it's very odd. There's nothing commanded there. But the Jewish tradition treats that statement as a command. Okay, just kind of odd. This latitude, back to the Bible Study Magazine portion, this latitude arises from the fact that the Hebrew text of the Old Testament exclusively uses Aseret HaDevarim, 10 words, instead of Aseret HaMitzvot, 10 commands, with respect to the contents of Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. After regarding Exodus 20, verse 2 as the first word of the 10 words, again, this is in Jewish tradition, verses 3 through 6 are then thematically understood as speaking to a single prohibition, and that is making idols for worship. That's what's prohibited. There are actually 3 imperative statements in this group of verses 3 through 6. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. But to consider them as separate commands would move the total beyond 10. Now, let me stop there. So, in other words, Jewish tradition is going to take that first statement in Exodus 22 as one of the words. And then these three imperatives that follow in verses 3 through 6, they're also going to split out. Okay. And what you've got here is you've got more than 10 words. Just like Sarna said, in Jewish tradition, you actually have 13 commandments. So if you take verse 2, okay, that's not a commandment, but it's one of the words. So this is going to sound really odd. It's not a command, but it's one of the 10 words. But now we're going to take the three imperatives that follow in verses 3 and 6 and split them out into separate commands. And if we add that to what's left, we come out with 13. So we have 13 words, 13 commands, even though Exodus 34 says 10 words. It gets really odd. But again, as Sarna noted, in Jewish tradition, the actual number of imperatives, the actual number of commands, if you pressed them and said, well, what are the commands? How many commands? How many commandments did Israel get? They would say 13, and then they'd wait for you to have the deer in the headlights look. Because they're Jewish and you're not. They know Hebrew and you don't. So they're right and you're wrong. It's that kind of discussion. So this is how it's arrived at. It's 13 imperatives. But again, you could see, I'll just read them again. Here are the three in verses 3 through 6. You get, you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image. You shall not bow to them or serve them. Okay, so those are three different commands, but they all sort of point to the same thing. And you say, well, we're not going to split them out. We're going to put them all together. Now we got 10. So there. Again, this is how the debate goes. Back to the Bible Study Magazine for one more little paragraph here. Christian perceptions of Exodus 20 are not rooted in the Hebrew terminology, Aseret HaDevarim, 10 words. And so Christian formulations do not regard verse 1 as the first point of the Decalogue. And as a result, all of Exodus 20 verses 2 through 6 is considered the starting point, and the imperative wording, you shall not, prompted the commandment terminology so widely known and used today. And that's the end of the excerpt. And again, those three separate imperatives that all point to the same thing are considered essentially one. So the numbering is actually an issue. Again, this was fought about between Jews and Christians. It became an issue between Protestants and Catholics. And so if you go to the episode webpage and you look at the chart there, you get a nice visualization of what the disagreements are and why they are what they are. Sarna lastly comments that Jewish, again, rabbinic tradition, again, numbers the commands as more than 10. Again, you get 13, not 10. And this has become a sort of part of rabbinic tradition. But at any rate, 10 words, the actual biblical terminology from Exodus 34:28, seems to settle the number dispute. At least I'm thinking, this is me now. I'm thinking, well, look, it calls it 10 words. So what are you doing fiddling around with this 13 thing? Just, forget that. But I would say Exodus 34:28 should settle that. So it seems best to try and articulate whatever these 10 words were as 10, as a unit of 10. But again, that's just me, and you can look at the chart on the episode webpage. Fourth consideration for today's episode: what kind of law are the 10 commandments, these 10 words? Okay, what kind of law? And you say, well, what do you mean? They're just laws. Well, there are two types of law in the Hebrew Bible. And basically everybody knows this and everybody agrees on it. And these are going to be distinctions that we sort of in our legal systems, in the modern world are familiar with. So 2 types of laws in the Hebrew Bible. One is casuistic law. That's casuistic, casuistic law. These are if-then laws. So if X does this, or X happens to be the case, then Y will happen, or Y is the outcome. So X, if then, X, then Y. This is very common in ancient Near Eastern legal codes. You see this all the time. The other kind of law is apodictic law. These are absolute prohibitions, thou shalt nots. Now, these don't lay out any conditions like the first kind does. There's no conditions here. These are absolute prohibitions. They are categorical, and they usually involve issues of religion and worship or morality. Now, Dictionary of Old Testament Pentateuch points out that, here's the quote, even if death is not prescribed, death is the understood penalty for breaking apodictic laws. Some scholars initially argued that the apodictic laws were uniquely Israelite, with the Sitz im Leben, that's a German phrase for the life setting, being Israelite religion. Thus, these laws reflected Israel's attempt to live completely under the guidance of their God. This argument is no longer credible because apodictic laws have been found in other ancient Near Eastern materials as well. Instead, apodictic law seems to operate in settings that rely upon persuasion for urging compliance with the law rather than upon physical force or structures. Unquote. Now, I think this language and this assessment that I just read needs some rewording and, frankly, some rethinking in light of Exodus 19, verses 5 through 6, which we naturally covered earlier in an earlier episode. Just to remind you, Exodus 19, verses 5 and 6 says, Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples. For all the earth is mine. You shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel. That was God to Moses. So I would say it doesn't matter that other ancient Near Eastern cultures had apodictic laws. So what? The reasons for the apodictic laws are the issue. It's certainly true that Israel's identity was supposed to be distinct from the other nations. Again, and I think that is something we should not lose in our discussion here. Dictionary of Old Testament Pentateuch, that same entry goes on later to say this. The context for the giving of the Decalogue is a religious one, as God provides a covenant and in some sense a founding charter for the people delivered out of Egypt. Penalties need to be stated and enforced when laws are broken, if those laws are to be functionally effective. The stipulations of the Decalogue lack any prescribed punishment for those who break these laws, relying on fear of the Lord to promote allegiance to the terms of the covenant. Here, let me stop there. I would say, yeah, there's certainly the element of the fear of the Lord, but there's also the element of being holy and being a kingdom of priests. Back to the quote. Finally, the Decalogue addresses subject matter that is not culture specific, but that instead has universal relevance and appeals to principles broadly held. For these reasons, the stipulations that form the Decalogue may be legitimately understood as ordinances or principles, rather than laws in the strictest sense, going by these definitions. So, okay, to me that's quibbling a little bit, but again, I think there's content in there that's worth hearing and then making part of our own thoughts in relationship to what we're going to think about as we go through the laws in succeeding episodes. Fifth issue, the content and structure of the Decalogue. Now, it has long been realized that the content and structural elements of the Decalogue, again, both in terms of where it's positioned and its own order and all that kind of stuff, it's long been realized that the content and structure of the Decalogue bear some relationship to Hittite suzerain vassal treaties. The word suzerain is Suzerein. So this has long been known in biblical studies. This is because the Decalogue's context is clearly a covenant relationship. So we would expect it to look like covenants that people are going to know from other cultures and other parts of life, okay? Hence, scholars studying the structure of ancient Near Eastern covenants with the Sinai covenant have extended that inquiry to the content of the Decalogue and its placement in the wider book of Deuteronomy as well. Okay, recall that the Decalogue is repeated in Deuteronomy. Now, usually when you run into studies about the Decalogue and its relationship to Hittite suzerain vassal treaties, it's going to be like in a commentary on the book of Deuteronomy, not necessarily Exodus. So since the Decalogue is repeated essentially in both places, I wanted to bring this issue up, even though it's more pertinent to what we see in Deuteronomy in terms of a covenantal structure. But you still have a covenantal context here in Exodus 20, very obviously. Now, in Dictionary of the Old Testament Pentateuch, I'm going to read from a couple of the different essays here. The covenants essay in that volume says this: suzerain vassal types of covenants. There are between a major power and a lesser nation. parity treaties sought to establish non-aggression between the parties and to guarantee the stability of the respective ruling dynasties. Suzerain vassal treaties served to consolidate the hegemony of the suzerain, the greater power. The vassal's interest, the lesser power, were clearly subordinate. Okay, end of quote. Now, the form criticism essay in Dictionary of the Old Testament Pentateuch says this. It adds this content. G.E. Mendenhall, who is a very famous scholar, deceased, maintained that the Book of Deuteronomy in its organizational structure and form is very similar to certain suzerain vassal treaties common in the ancient Near East. In its arrangement, Deuteronomy may thus be viewed as reflecting the same core sections, appearing in roughly the same order as are found in ancient Hittite suzerain vassal treaties. These sections are as follows. There's a preamble, there's a historical prologue, it relates some historical circumstance. There are general stipulations given in the covenant. Then there are more specific stipulations given in the covenant. There are blessings and curses. There are witnesses brought, to bear witness to what's going on here. And again, the witnesses sort of sign off. So those are the elements of a Hittite suzerain vassal treaty. And if you look at the way the Decalogue is presented in Deuteronomy, it really fairly closely follows those elements. Now back to the Dictionary of the Old Testament Pentateuch quote. When viewed in this light, the structure of Deuteronomy is a mirror reflection of a treaty form borrowed from a neighboring Near Eastern culture. This understanding of Deuteronomy, however, has not met with universal acceptance among scholars. Now, elsewhere, he's going to say this, the same entry. It should be noted here that the general stipulations, again, that's the part of Deuteronomy where the Decalogue falls, and then the specific stipulations come later. There are scholars, again, and I'm going to quote Eugene Carpenter here. Again, we're out of Dictionary of Old Testament Pentateuch now, and Carpenter I want to throw in. He adds this. There are scholars who have attempted to show that the literary structure and the content of sections of Deuteronomy form an exposition of each of these 10 words in order as they are repeated in Deuteronomy 5, 7 through 21. That's the end of the Carpenter quote. Now, I threw that in for this reason. He cites John Walton and Andrew Hill, their survey of the Old Testament, because they mention this. But another one of his sources is from Stephen Kaufman, The Structure of the Deuteronomic Law. It's in an Israeli journal, Marav it's called. And it's a very lengthy article. It's 50 pages. Now, I bring it up for this reason. I think it's kind of important that we recognize that what is happening in Deuteronomy and also what's happening in Exodus, once you get out of the Decalogue, is that the content that follows, the legal stuff, the law stuff, the commandment stuff, is in fact deliberate. It's intentional. That there is an attempt to apply the principles, of the Decalogue to life situations, and so it's sort of an exposition of the Decalogue in both of these books, both of these cases, and that's important for realizing that, well, maybe that's why. Part of the reason, anyway, we have the Decalogues positioned where they are. They naturally have to precede what's going to follow in terms of an explication or actual situations that Israel is going to find itself in, the people. And they're going to have to be, thinking about what to do in light of the ethical principles laid out in the Decalogue. So, again, this is very, I think, understandable when you realize what's going on after the commands are given, that they're just being unpacked again in certain situations, life circumstances, life situations, in both Exodus and Deuteronomy. Now, Sarna, however, I think it's fair to say probably that the majority of scholars accept some relationship of the Decalogue to the Hittite suzerain treaty idea. Now, Sarna is an example who hesitates, though, to embrace the model, and I wanted to include him, because his reasoning is kind of interesting. Now, you think of what the Hittite suzerain vassal treaty was. It was a treaty, it was a covenant between an absolute authority and a lesser entity. Okay? where the interests of the lesser entity aren't so much in view. It's the establishment of hegemony by the superior power in that kind of ancient Near Eastern treaty, the Hittite variety. That's kind of what Sarna objects to, the sort of the characterization. What a comparison to the Hittite suzerain vassal model sort of suggests or entails. And he writes this: a study of these documents, particularly a suzerain vassal treaty where one party transparently imposes its will on the other, leaves no doubt as to the influence of the ancient Near Eastern treaty patterns on the external, formal, literary aspects of the biblical berit, the biblical covenant. The affinities are to be expected. In order for the berit, the covenant, to be intelligible to the Israelites, it made sense to structure it according to the accepted patterns of the then universally recognized legal instruments. So he's okay with that part. Okay, it reflects the structure. But again, he doesn't like sort of the implications. He writes this, Sarna says, the Decalogue and its contents are, however, in a class by themselves. The idea of a covenantal relationship between God and an entire people is unparalleled. Similarly unique is the setting of the covenant in a narrative context. It is the latter that imparts to the covenant its meaning and its significance. The covenant would be devalued were the link between them to be severed. Another major and original feature is the manner in which the content of the berit, the covenant, embraces the internal life of the vassal by regulating individual behavior and human relationships. Such a preoccupation with social affairs is beyond the scope and intent of all other ancient treaties, whose sole concern is with the external affairs of the vassal, unquote. I actually think that's well said. He's saying, look, you can't, even though the covenant could be modeled by the Hittite suzerain, model or Hittite suzerain vassal treaty, he's saying, okay, structurally we can see that, but we can't lose sight of the fact of what makes this one, the Israelite one, unique. It's part of a narrative, which the others are never part of the narrative, and it's linked to more than an overlording relationship with Yahweh. There's a love relationship here going on in the Israelite circumstances, and that is something you don't find in the suzerain vassal treaty. So I wanted to include, Sarna again because of his objection. I think there's substance to it. So lastly, our last consideration here for this episode is number 6. Why 2 tablets? Okay, why 2 tablets? Because you get that in the story. Now Sarna writes this: several biblical texts testify to the inscribing of the Decalogue on 2 stone tablets. The practice of recording covenants on tablets was well rooted in the biblical world, as was also the custom mentioned in Exodus 25:16. I'll read that. And you shall put into the ark the testimony that I shall give you. Okay. So the practice of recording covenants on tablets, that's common, as was also the custom of depositing the document in a sanctuary. A treaty between the Hittite king Shupi-Liumas and King Matiwaza of Mitanni in Upper Mesopotamia noted that each of the contracting parties deposited a copy in his respective temple before the shrine of the deity. Similarly, when Ramses II of Egypt and the Hittite king Hattusilus concluded a treaty around the year 1269 BC, the clauses were inscribed on a tablet of silver, which was placed, quote, at the feet of the god. Okay. Why 2 tablets were needed for the Decalogue, Sarna says, is unclear, nor do we know the spatial distribution of the text. The Mechilta, again, that's rabbinic material, assumes that 5 declarations were incised on each tablet, which is the tradition reflected in Jewish art since the 13th century Spanish illuminated Bible manuscripts. However, such an arrangement would have resulted in a grave imbalance in Hebrew. One tablet would have contained 146 Hebrew words and the other only 26. The Palestinian Talmud has preserved a different tradition, there given as the majority view that each tablet contained the entire Decalogue. That's the end of the Sarna quote. Now, the notion that both tablets held the complete Decalogue, in other words, you don't have 2 tablets, there's like 5 on one, 5 on the other, that kind of thing. we're talking about here that both tablets had the entire set of laws on them, entire set of commands. That idea may be derived. It might derive from Exodus 32:15, which says this: When Moses turned and went down from the mountain with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hand, tablets that were written on both sides, on the front and on the back, they were written, which is kind of interesting. We kind of missed that detail, that they're written on 2 sides. Now, Currid, again, he's the Egyptologist, trained Egyptologist, Old Testament scholar. We consulted a lot with the plagues. He writes, and he's quoting Meredith Kline here, who is a now deceased Old Testament scholar. I like Kline because he thinks out of the box. But he's quoting Kline here. Currid thinks that the answer lies in the ancient Near Eastern covenant practices. So here's what he says. It is now clear that the 2 tablets did not have different laws written upon each of them as was previously thought. As Kline comments, quote, the 2 tablets were duplicate copies of the covenant, and the correctness of this interpretation is decisively confirmed by the fact that it was normal procedure in establishing suzerainty covenants to prepare duplicate copies of the treaty text, unquote. And he's quoting from Kline's book, Treaty of the Great King, where Kline does a lot of this comparison with ancient Near Eastern covenantal structures. So what he's basically saying is, look, you have these examples with Ramses and the Hittite kings. They make 2 copies of the covenant, and then each of them deposits it with their deity at their respective homes, respective temples, whatever. Kline's saying, look, the 2 tablets did the same thing. They're 2 copies of the complete law, the complete Decalogue. Now, it's not made, the treaty is not made with another deity. So both of the copies get deposited in the ark. That's why we have 2. And on each, again, there's the full set. Now, I would say that's reasonable, though it's a little odd that the people would never see them. Okay, people, both tablets are kept in the ark. Okay, we know that to be the case. Nor is there any indication that they could be taken out and more copies made. So, note that there's nothing said about Moses or somebody else copying the text of the tablets before they were deposited so as to eventually have them codified in Scripture. Now, this raises a problem. Well, if both of the copies are put in the ark, well, nobody's taking them out. The high priest can't do that. I mean, he's only allowed in there once a year, and he can't touch the thing. So where do we get the laws? How do we know? Well, again, I think we can guess that, again, Moses or some other writer, whoever is actually the one, you could have a later writer taking, oral tradition that comes from the time of Moses and, putting it down into words and all that. This gets into the authorship issue, whatever. Somebody, before they were deposited within the ark, I think would have made a copy of them. They would have written it out in some other form so that the people can know them and then they can be taught. And then the 2 tablets are stuck in there. There's no verse that contradicts that idea. There's no verse that says it, but there's no verse that contradicts that idea. We simply aren't told anything in that regard. So we have to suppose either that was done or the text was memorized. Maybe it was, oral. Maybe somebody memorized it. It's not that long. We have to presume something like that if we are going to presume an actual alignment of what was inscribed on the tablets with what we are reading today in our Bibles. We have to assume something like that happened. Now, those are the 6 issues I wanted to cover, to introduce the 10 Commandments, Exodus 20 more properly. And so next time on the podcast, we're going to dive into the individual commands. And there's a lot to think about in a number of them. So I think it'll take at least 2 episodes to go through the Decalogue. But I think, again, all these things, are good setup. We will periodically, dip into this content when we're discussing, some of the other, the individual commands. But again, for right now, I think that was a good, introduction to the kinds of things that scholars think about when they approach something to us that's apparently as simple as 10 commandments. Again, not quite that simple. There are issues here that need some consideration, and that will matter a little bit down the road.
All right. Well, good. Well, this is part 2, so I'm ready if you are.
Yep. So if you didn't listen to the previous episode, I mean, it's not required for this one, but this is part 2, and we're just starting the commandments. So part one was, covering a bunch of issues that sort of arise from the text, where the Decalogue, again, the Ten Commandments are placed, what kind of commands they are, what's actually the number, so on and so forth. So there were 5 or 6 different things that we talked about in the first episode that sort of lead up to actually jumping in. We're at the jumping in point now, and so in this part we're going to hit the first 4 commands. So I think the rest of them are manageable in a part 3. So that looks like how we're going to do it. So again, in the last episode, I read something from Sarna's commentary, his Exodus commentary, in regard to the number of the commands. So I'm going to read this part again, just to sort of refresh people that there was actually an issue with the numbering. But we're going to go with the traditional 10, just so that we don't create confusion. But again, just so that you know why this is an issue, Sarna writes this. He says, interestingly, the Jewish tradition treats the statement in Exodus 20, verse 2, and let me read it, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. It treats that statement as a command when the wording has no imperative force to it at all. Now, this latitude, Sarna writes, arises from the fact that the Hebrew text of the Old Testament exclusively uses aseret ha-devarim, 10 words, instead of aseret ha-mitzvot, which is the Hebrew for 10 commandments. So Hebrew, the Hebrew Bible actually refers to the Decalogue as the 10 words, not 10 commands. And so that's why they can sort of treat verse 2 as one of these words, even though it's not a command. Okay. So Sarna keeps going. He says, after regarding Exodus 20, verse 2 as the first word of the 10, verses 3 through 6 are then thematically understood as speaking to a single prohibition. That is, don't make idols. Don't make idols for worship. There are actually 3 imperative statements in this group of verses, though. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image. And you shall not bow down to them or serve them. But to consider them as separate commands would move the total beyond 10. If you take all the imperatives as 3 separate commands, then you're way over 10. You're actually at 13. And Sarna goes on to point out that that's actually part of Jewish tradition as well. If you asked a rabbi a certain period, the rabbinic period is basically medieval. Hey, how many commands are there in Exodus 20? When he heard the word commands, he would think of the imperatives. Oh, there's 13. But again, since they look at it as 10 words, they can lump some of those together and have one word beginning in verse 2, and then we go on from there. So there's actually an issue here. We talked about that last time. We, for our purposes, are just going to go with 10 commandments. Again, I know that that's not technically precise. We're not counting imperatives here. This isn't a Hebrew exegesis class. So just so the listeners out there who would like this to be a Hebrew exegesis class sort of balk at 10 commandments, I get it. All right, I know, I understand. We're just going to go with the traditional numbering here to avoid confusion. Now, as we jump in to the very first series here, I want you to be thinking about the patriarchal faith here, what preceded Moses, and that which marks the basis by which after the Tower of Babel episode, God moves to restore to himself a human family, and therefore the Edenic dream or goal. Now, a lot of people mistakenly assume the Abrahamic covenant to be unconditional, and that is simply not true. So let me just stop there. I want you to be thinking about the basis of the relationship between God and Abraham, really Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all the way up to the time of Moses. Because when we get to Sinai, we're going to have this covenant, and the law is going to be part of this covenant. The 10 Commandments are going to be part of this covenant. Well, what happened? What's the basis of the relationship with God prior to that? And I'm going to argue it's the same even after. But since you get a whole list of commands from Sinai onward, again, that's not about meriting your salvation. Again, we'll talk a little bit about this, as in the episodes that follow. But it defined, the Sinai covenant defined one's relationship with Yahweh. You were in covenant with Yahweh, and there were expectations to be in the covenant. That doesn't preclude or exclude the necessity of belief. Again, what we would call, faith. It's not this that, now we, after Sinai, just blind obedience in every jot and tittle that merits, your salvation now. No, God is never in your debt. The issue with the law, Sinai, is that this defines your relationship, with Yahweh in the sense that this is how you are supposed to live and believe for a couple of reasons. I should say this is how you're supposed to live and behave, for a couple of reasons. One is, if you do this, if you live this way, it shows that you believe that Yahweh, that this deity Yahweh, is the one who took you out of Egypt and is the true God, is the God of gods, is superior to all other gods. So you believe that, and so you want to be in this relationship with him, because to be outside of it, that would be bad. I mean, what assurance do you have, of resurrection, of hope in the afterlife? I mean, what assurance do you have at all if you're not in relationship to the God who's really the God of gods? And so you do these things not to put that God in your debt, like he owes you something now. You've earned a place at the table. You do it because you believe who he is, and that you're going to trust him with your everlasting destiny, whatever that might be. This is just the way to look at Sinai. This takes us into the whole works of the law controversy with Paul. And I would suggest to you that no Pharisee who understood the law is going to think that they're putting God in their debt by obeying the law. They're paranoid about following the law because of the exile. They don't ever want to see that circumstance happen again. They know what resulted from disloyalty to their covenant relationship. They were expelled from the land. And in Jesus' day, they're back in the land. They at least are occupying it, even though the all 12 tribes are not restored. So in that sense, the excluded tribes, there's still a sense of exile, not with the two that come back from Babylon, because that was only a 70-year captivity. But the others, there's still this sense of exile. There's still this sense of being in this situation. And so this is a real consciousness. We want to follow the law so that this doesn't happen to us again. It's not that we think that God owes us something now. We're always at the mercy of God. What Paul's really talking about with the works of the law is that you should no longer define your identity, your relationship with God, by virtue of the Sinai covenant. Instead, you should define your relationship with God by virtue of Jesus. Okay, the Messiah, identifying him as the Messiah and the initiator of the new covenant that was promised in the Old Testament, and believing that this Messiah, Jesus, was God in the flesh, God come as a man to fulfill the rest of the covenants, usher in the new covenant, and now our faith is in him. We recognize him as the incarnate God of Israel, who sacrificed himself for our behalf, and we live the way we do now, both to attract people, just like it should have been in the Old Testament, attract people to the faith, but also, again, to show the world where our loyalty is. Our loyalty is to this one now, Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus the Messiah. So that's what Paul is after. Change your identification, change the way you're thinking about how you show your loyalty and your belief, how you illustrate and demonstrate your belief to the true God. It's no longer by the law of Sinai. Now it's by faith in Christ. That's really what he's after. He's not attacking a merit-based way of thinking. Now, I'm sure there were Jews out there somewhere that thought that got it wrong, thought that God was put in their debt by virtue of them obeying the law. But again, and Paul's one of these, any self-respecting Jew or Israelite who sort of understands the necessity of belief, that what God is after is the heart, not just performance. Anybody who understood that from the Old Testament is going to know that it's never about putting God in your debt. So we need to think about that in relationship to where we are here, because I'm going to suggest, and I've suggested many times, and of course in the unseen realm I do this, that's the way that it was with the patriarchs. At all times, patriarchs before Moses, Sinai, the time of Moses, and of course the theocratic state of Israel, the monarchy, whatever, biblical Israel. And then afterwards, after the exile with Jesus, up until right now, it's always been the same. Believing, loyalty. That is salvation. Belief, and then you illustrate that belief. You confirm it in terms of how people are wondering, well, where's your faith at? What God do you serve? You reinforce that, you illustrate it, you demonstrate it through the way you live. And it's no different before Sinai and after Sinai. Again, we're talking about Christians now in the New Covenant. And again, I would suggest it really wasn't any different in biblical Israel. You believe that Yahweh is the God of gods, that he has entered into a covenant relationship with you, and you demonstrate that belief by worshiping no other. And you want to be loyal to him out of gratitude. You're thankful to him, and so you want to do the law, again, for the right reasons, not to put God in your debt. So let's just be thinking about that, because when it comes to the Abrahamic covenant, I'm going to show you that this is consistent. There are a lot of, especially Christians, because of their eschatological situation or their position or what they've been taught, that they insist that the Abrahamic covenant was unconditional. If that's true, then salvation is different before the time of Moses, and it's really actually different in the sense of the new covenant as well. It's not different. The Abrahamic covenant does have conditions. Abraham had to believe and be loyal to Yahweh. Loyalty was the means by which belief was shown. Abraham, he couldn't just decide to reject the sign of circumcision. Okay, so here we have Genesis 15. Abraham believed God, and it was counted unto him as for righteousness. Okay, Paul quotes this verse in Romans 4. It's Genesis 15:6. Well, Abraham couldn't believe and have God count it to him for righteousness. And then, 2 chapters later, when God says, okay, here's the sign of the covenant, circumcision, Abraham's like, forget that. I'm not doing that. That's going to hurt. I don't get it. I don't see any reason for it. I already believe, so why am I going to do that? He can't just reject the demonstration of his loyalty. Because if he did, that would show that he is disloyal. It would show that he doesn't believe that Yahweh is who he is. He doesn't believe that if he did believe it, he would obey. And Abraham does obey because he does believe that. And in fact, when you get to Genesis 22, the offering of Isaac, Abraham couldn't just say, I'm not going to do that. Not going to go through with that. I heard you, Lord, loud and clear, but I'm just not going to do that. All right, Abraham believes, and that's why he takes, Isaac up and is about to go through with offering him. And we actually get a hint of this in Genesis 22:5, where, if we read the verse, again, and the book of Hebrews picks up on this. Abraham said to his young men, as he's about to take Isaac up on the mountain, stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship, and we will come again to you. The verb is plural, and come again to you. It's plural. Abraham, you'd say, well, Abraham's bluffing. He's just lying to these guys. No. The book of Hebrews actually alludes to this verse and says that Abraham believed that God was able to raise up his son again. He was serious. He believed that somehow God would give him his son back. So what he does is a demonstration of faith. It's belief. And again, it's right there in the grammar. In this case, we will come again to you. He's being absolutely sincere. So again, there are conditions here. If Abraham doesn't do this, it shows he doesn't believe. Again, if he obeys, it's not that, okay, God, you got to pony up now. I performed well. That is not the issue, and it's not the issue with Sinai either. Well, the point about bringing all this up, with Abraham, the Abrahamic covenant and its conditions is just to summarize, you have to believe before the law, the period of the law, and of course the New Testament period. You have to believe, and if you do believe, you will live a certain way. Again, none of these instances, Abraham, Moses, anybody righteous in the Old Testament period, Paul, when you get to the work of Christ, nobody is thinking that we should do works to put God in our debt. Nobody is thinking that. if they're thinking, correctly. It's consistent across the Testaments. You must believe, and if you do, you will live a certain way. And we already know from Exodus, when we hit Exodus 19, that part of the logic of living a certain way was to attract the nations, back and be the kingdom of priests and a holy nation and all that stuff. I get that, but and that's fine because it's biblical theology. But notice that if that's the motivation, if that's the rationale for it, it's still not putting a God in your debt. That is not what's going on here. And so again, just to apply this to us, and we did enough of this in the book of Hebrews. I'm not going to rehearse all this territory, but Christians, okay, you need to stop thinking about your works being the necessary element to your salvation. Faith is the necessary element to your salvation. Works are for lots of reasons. Earning salvation is not one of them. And this is going to be consistent across the board. So when we jump into the commands, okay, it's not about, again, earning a position. It's about defining a relationship that you have with God because you believe who he is. You are going to enter into the covenant. You're going to approve, the Israelites are going to approve the covenant, with God because they believe that, good grief, this is the God who defeated the gods of Egypt and took us out of Egypt, and look at the Red Sea and the manna and all this stuff. They believe this. I mean, they're going to make a statement of faith, and then they're going to enter into this covenant relationship and agree to live a certain way, to honor that God, to honor his sacred space, to honor his presence, to honor each other as members of the same family, to attract the nations. Again, these are all reasons why believing Israelites are supposed to live the way they're supposed to live. Again, you have to be really wrong-headed to think that, okay, I did this, now God owes me something. And that's just not in the picture. It's not the point. So listen to how the Decalogue begins in light of all that. This is Exodus 20, verses 2 through 6. And God spoke all these words. So you're at this mountain scene, and God just starts speaking. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Now, let me stop there. The point is Pharaoh, if you remember the Exodus story, Pharaoh had mockingly asked, who is Yahweh? Well, he got his answer. The whole point of delivering Israel and the hardening of Pharaoh's heart was to answer that question, not only for Pharaoh, but also for Yahweh's own people. They had to believe Yahweh was the God of all gods. When God says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, they're like, yep, you sure did. And we know what that means. It means you are the God of all gods. Okay, all of this was to bring them to faith. Okay? So they had to believe that Yahweh was the God of all gods, the God of their fathers, the God who had supernaturally created them by virtue of Abraham and Sarah. This is the God of our fathers. I mean, they have to believe all this stuff. They have to believe that he is who he says he is. And if you go back in Exodus, this is sort of clear in hindsight. I mean, all this disaster, the plagues that come on the gods of Egypt, they have a purpose. Exodus 6:7, I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God who has brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. Exodus 7:5, the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring out the people of Israel from among them. So the Egyptians are going to learn the lesson that their gods are lesser, and Israel is going to learn the lesson, and they're going to believe that their God, this God, is the God of all gods. Exodus 8:10, he said, Moses said to Pharaoh, be pleased to command me when I am to plead for you and your servants and for the people, that the frogs be cut off from you and your houses and be left only in the Nile. And he said, Pharaoh speaking, tomorrow. And Moses said, be it as you say, so that you may know that there is no one like the Lord our God. Again, this is just the whole point. Exodus 14, the Red Sea crossing. I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. And I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his host, and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. Verse 18, again, and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. This is why these things happen. So for the Egyptians, and if Egyptians convert, they turn into believers, they go along. We know the Exodus story says that a number of the people of Egypt, Israel's neighbors, they went with them. They were convinced. I mean, that does happen. the judgment part of it happens too. That Pharaoh, he lets the people go, but he's not like becoming a Yahweh follower. Well, some of the Egyptians did. Some of them did. A mixed multitude went out, okay, of Egypt and followed, Moses and the rest of the Israelites into the desert. So this is how the Decalogue begins. Do you know this now? I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Now, because of that, because you know that and you believe it, verse 3, you shall have no other gods before me. Okay, it's not like you could sit there, be an Israelite, and believe in no deity, but just never go through life and make an idol. I'm good now. I never made an idol. Lord, you said I wasn't supposed to make an idol, so here we are, at the pearly gates, and you got to let me in here because I never made an idol. No, that isn't the point. The performance is not the point. The performance demonstrates something that is believed. We just have to get this straight in our heads. So this is the loyalty element. Don't have other gods before me. Believe that Yahweh is your God and reserve all of your loyalty for him. This is believing loyalty all over again. Now, as a sidebar, notice that the command doesn't deny the existence of other Elohim. I'm not going to go off into unseen realm territory here. We're all well familiar with that. If you're new to the podcast, you've never read my book, Unseen Realm, or the lighter version, Supernatural, you need to read one or both of those, to go off into the nature of Elohim in the Hebrew Bible, and that the gods were real, but Yahweh is species unique. Yahweh is an Elohim. No other Elohim or Yahweh ontologically by definition. Okay, this is the theology even of the Decalogue. You shall have no other gods before me. In other words, you're not being loyal to anybody else, but me. Okay, I am the Lord your God. The Lord our God is one. Okay, so again, we right here in the Decalogue, we get this flavor for it. The best place to read is Deuteronomy, because Deuteronomy affirms, if you understand Deuteronomy 4 and against the backdrop of Deuteronomy 17, the first few verses, and Deuteronomy 29, right around verses 23 through 26, Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9, reading verse 8 with the Dead Sea Scrolls, and Deuteronomy 32, 17. The gods are real in the biblical writer's mind. They are spirit beings. That's all they are. Okay, they are lesser. They're contingent. God created them. The God of the Bible created everything, all things in heaven and earth, visible and invisible, all that. Okay, there are lots of Elohim. All the term means is spirit beings. It has nothing to do with a unique set of attributes. But Yahweh among them is ontologically unique. Only he is sovereign, omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, all this stuff. He's the only one that those things are said about. He is unique. So there's one of him. Let's go back to Exodus 20. So we have, I am the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods before me. Verse 4. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. It's pretty clear. That the plagues should have taught Israel that Yahweh was above all creation, not part of it. So by definition, no, don't make an image of anything, any likeness that's in heaven above or earth beneath or the water under the earth. Notice the three-tiered cosmology there, the ancient Near Eastern cosmology. Right there it is in the Decalogue. You're not going to make an image of any of those things in any of those spheres, of your worldview of Israelite cosmology here. Don't do that, because the Lord your God is not part of creation. He's the one who is separate from and responsible for creation. He's the one who created. He is the creator, not a created thing. Okay, he is completely other. Nothing in creation is like him or his equal. He is unrepresentable by anything in creation. So, if you think about this, God would veil himself when present, clouds or the storm theophany, the storm clouds and all that stuff, or he'd remain out of sight. And the scene that we've been reading in Exodus 19 with Sinai is kind of like that. You see the storm, atmosphere at the top of the mountain and the burning and the fire and all that, but you never see, Yahweh himself. Now, he does at some points, and he's going to in Exodus 24, decide to let some of the Israelites see at least part of him. When he does decide to show himself, guess how that happens? He comes as a man. He appears as a man. It's Exodus 24, all right? We're going to get there, but you probably already know the verse, 9 through 11. They see, Moses, Aaron, Nadav, Avihu, the 70 elders. They go up into the mountain and they quote, they saw the God of Israel. They see what's under his feet, so they can see, part of his form. That it doesn't say they see his face, but there's a man there, and they know it. It's kind of like Ezekiel 1. There's a seated man on a throne, the divine man, quote unquote, as scholars like to refer to him. You get these episodes where God does decide to show himself, at least partially, and in some cases it's even more dramatic. God does show up as a man. I would say the angel of the Lord is one of those. You can read. I've got 3 chapters in this in Unseen Realm. Again, I know how to make this case, and the case is a good one. That Yahweh is the angel of the Lord. You have the 2 Yahwehs, the invisible transcendent one, and then the visible human one. They can be in the same scene or different. But this is a precursor to Judaism's 2 powers in heaven. Judaism used to believe in a Godhead until the 2nd century AD. Timing is not a coincidence there because of the advent of Christianity. This used to be a normal part of Jewish theology, what they called the 2 Yahwehs, the 2 powers in heaven, the greater and lesser Yahweh, okay? They both bore the divine name. This was part of Jewish thinking. It comes right out of the Hebrew Bible. So you have instances like Genesis 18 where God comes as a man, has a meal with Abraham, with 2 others, 2 angels. We find out they're angels in Genesis 19. God does this. And in some of those instances, you can't say that like the face was covered. They have conversations. We don't really know that for sure, but there's no indication in the passage that God is like wearing a hood or something. They have a meal. They sit down and have a meal. Abraham speaks to God, like he would any other person, interceding for Sodom. I mean, this does happen, but God veils himself in, this form. And it's a precursor to the later, Christian, the way Christians think and the way the New Testament writes about Jesus. Okay, God is man. Now, the incarnation is a bit different. It ups the ante because God is born of a woman there. But, one sort of sets up the other. So, when you go back to the command, how do we reconcile these things? Don't make for yourself any carved image and, anything that's in heaven above, the earth beneath, the water under the earth. But God will, do this. And so you would think that, well, God came as a man. Can't we make it like an idol of a man? No, you're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to bow down to any created thing, a thing made with your own hands. See, the key here is the bowing down. And we know this to be the case because God later in the book of Exodus tells them to make objects of heavenly things, the cherubim. Well, did God just violate his own command here? No, because the issue is the worship, is the bowing down. So God can come as a man, but don't you go make an idol of a man, a figure of a man. You can't justify it by saying, well, God showed up, as a man, so we're going to make this statue. It's a man. We're going to bow down to it. God will know we're worshiping him. No, you do not bow down to anything made with human hands, period. Don't do it. And even the Ark of the Covenant, when God tells them, how to do this and how to fashion, the cherubim and all that sort of thing, you're not supposed to worship the Ark. Okay, the Ark isn't supposed to become a fetish. And we know it from Israelite history that sometimes this kind of thing happens, like with the bronze serpent. It became an object of worship later in Israel's history, and it had to be destroyed. We know that this sort of transgression did happen. But the issue here with the command is that you bow down to nothing made, with human hands, because again, it's a theological statement that our God is not made. Our God is by definition uncreated. He is not part of creation. He is not made. So this is a theological statement, and it's a really important one. And observing it, again, is part of believing loyalty. Again, just to use my earlier illustration, you can't just sit there. You get to the pearly gates, as it were, and, I'm here, Lord, I was a faithful Israelite. I never made an idol. You have to let me in. No, that isn't the point. The point is not the performance. The performance demonstrates belief. Okay, so we're back at the same point again. Now, I would say this applies again to like our pictures of Jesus today. Like if you have a picture of Jesus on your wall, should you take it down and destroy it? No. If you're bowing down to it, you probably, you need to get rid of it. You need to stop doing that. Again, it's a theological statement that I will bow down to nothing that is made. I will only bow down to the uncreated God, to the uncreated Creator. That's it. That's the line in the sand. So again, these are theological statements in some pretty important ways. And verse 5, sort of elaborates on this, or I should say verse 4. Let me go back to Exodus 20 here. It is verse 5. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. Okay, so we have some added emphasis here. I'm a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. So jealous God. Sarna has a really nice summary here. I'm going to read it. I think this is pretty well said. He writes, the Hebrew stem, again for the word jealous, kaf, nun, okay, and aleph, kn, aleph, okay, in its primitive meaning seems to have denoted, quote, to become intensely red, unquote. Because extreme and intense emotions affect facial coloration, the term came by extension to express ardor or zeal or rage or jealousy. It is used in a variety of contexts, even with God as the referent. The limitations of language necessitate the application to God of phraseology that typically belongs in the human sphere. Again, what are we going to do? We're humans. We have to use human phrases. The present epithet, El Kana, okay, a jealous God, is most frequently translated a jealous God, a rendering that understands the marriage bond to be the implied metaphor for the covenant between God and his people. Let me stop there. There's no evidence in Exodus 20 that this is how marriages were conducted. Okay, in other words, the Israelite marriage ceremonies don't mimic what happens at Mount Sinai. Like there's no animal killed and blood sprinkled on everybody. So that's not what Sarna is talking about. There's no evidence for that. Rather, he's saying that the jealousy that would occur within a marriage if there's a violation, that becomes the point of the metaphor for what is trying to be conveyed here. God's attitude. It's really an attitude that is well understood within a marriage context because of the intimacy of the relationship and the potential violation. So back to Sarna. God demands exclusive loyalty from Israel, and according to this interpretation, his reaction, there we go, his reaction to their infidelity is expressed in terms of human jealousy. It should be noted, however, that the form kana is used in the Bible solely of God, never of a human being, a distinction that testifies to a consciousness that the emotion referred to differs qualitatively from the human variety. Whether one renders kana as jealous or impassioned, the term emphasizes that God cannot be indifferent to his creatures, and that he is deeply involved in human affairs. It underscores the vigorous, intensive, and punitive nature of the divine response to apostasy and to modes of worship unacceptable to himself. That's the end of Sarna. I just thought that was a really good summary, again, of how to think about the jealousy element. And the rest of the verse, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. Sarna, again, and note how these phrases are to be contextualized. I think Sarna, again, has a good summary. These are not curses only on individuals and their families. Let me just, telegraph where I'm going here. Notice verse 6. That God shows steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. Look, if you were an Israelite and your parents were apostates, but you follow the Lord your God with all your heart, you know what? God's going to love that. He's going to respond positively to that. Now, what I'm picking at here is this generational curse idea. Your relationship to God depends on your believing loyalty to Him. It is not going to be impeded or overturned or trashed by I almost want to say mythical, generational curse idea. Okay, some generational bugaboo curse that someone utters over you or somebody else that is not more powerful than the gospel. It just isn't. So stop believing lies. I get emails like this. Oh, my brother did this crime or whatever, or some witch, pronounced a curse over him and his family, and I'm the grandson and I'm cursed now. No, you're not. Stop believing lies. Stop giving power to something that has no power. And you cannot use a verse like this to justify it, because God will show steadfast love to thousands of those who love Him and keep His commandments. Believing loyalty. Where is your believing loyalty? If it's with Him, that's all you need. Is He the Lord your God who brought you up out of Egypt and out of the house of bondage? Is He the Creator? Is He who He says He is? If you claim to believe that, then start living like it. Stop believing lies. Okay, off my hobby horse now. Here's what Sarna writes on this section. He says, the Israelite conception of itself as a community bound to God by a covenant has dual implications. Society is collectively responsible for its actions. Okay? Society is collectively responsible for its actions. And the individual, too, is accountable for behavior that affects the life of the community. There is thus forged a mutuality of responsibility and consequences. Let me stop there. Yeah, if your grandpa committed a crime or something like that, yeah, your family's reputation is going to suffer. You could get caught up in that. It has nothing to do with your relationship with God, your eternal destiny. The crime of someone else and the stigma attached to it, or the social suffering that you endure for something, has nothing to do with your eternal destiny. Zero. Okay, so there's a difference between consequence, okay, and eternal destiny. I mean, I would think that would be clear, but again, I get these emails that people are so hung up on this generational cursing thing. Is Jesus, who is God in the flesh, Yahweh in the flesh, the God who brought Israel out of Egypt, is He and His work on the cross sufficient or not? That is the fundamental question. You either believe or you don't. So don't tell me you believe, but now you're cringing there in the corner that you're under a look, you don't need to pray long prayers of memorization. You don't need to, do the Christian voodoo stuff, of deliverance ministry to get rid of it. You know what you need to do? You need to start trusting God. You need to stop believing lies and start believing truth. That's what you need to do. And then live your life, be a disciple, be a partner in the Great Commission, and start doing the things you're supposed to be doing, and God will bless you. That's what you need to do. Back to Sarna. It is further recognized that contemporary conduct inevitably has an impact upon succeeding generations. It does. There are effects. These historical effects are perceived in terms of God, quote, visiting the sins of one faithless generation upon the next, or of His showing kindness, that is, rewarding fidelity far into the future. This understanding of God's governance of the world occurs many times in the Bible and has an educational function. Over time, however, this led to a pervasive feeling of hopelessness and apathy in an era of acute national crisis. Now, what Sarna is referring to, and he quotes Lamentations 5:7 here, is that when Babylon's knocking on the door, we get Lamentations 5:7. Our fathers have sinned and are no more, and we bear their iniquities. Well, yeah, because your fathers violated Leviticus 26 and they became idolaters. You're going to be driven from the land. The righteous will suffer along with the wicked. Those who were not guilty of those things, they're going to suffer the effects. But you know what? God still knows who the righteous are. So you can get driven to Babylon, and you can be sitting there by the river Kivar when Ezekiel has his vision, and you can believe. You can take hope in Ezekiel's message because he's sent to give the exiles hope. All right? You can still believe and be in right relationship with God and trust him with your eternal destiny. This has no effect. This has no impact on your eternal destiny. It may have an impact on how society looks at you, but spiritually speaking, this has zero power over your eternal destiny. Zero. Goose egg. Again, the point of what Sarna is saying, and peripherally what I'm getting at here is, if you look back at the exile, it's illustrative of community suffering. Again, the righteous do suffer with the unrighteous. Sin does have consequences. Scripture elsewhere juxtaposes this idea with individual guilt as well. Jeremiah 31, 29, 30, I'll just read that. In those days they shall no longer say, the fathers have eaten sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. Like the children are suffering for what the fathers did. But everyone shall die for his own iniquity. Each man who eats sour grapes, his teeth shall be set on edge. Ezekiel 18, 1 through 4. The word of the Lord came to me. What do you mean by repeating this proverb concerning the land of Israel? The fathers have eaten sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge. Ezekiel attacks this notion, about how because of what our fathers did, now our fate is sealed and blah, 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 blah. He says, as I live, declares the Lord, this proverb shall no more be used by you in Israel. Behold, all souls are mine. The soul of the Father, as well as the soul of the Son, is mine. The soul who sins shall die, and the soul who doesn't sin. Okay, the soul who, again, the believing loyalty. The heart that is aligned toward Yahweh will live. That's the whole point. I would also say, before we leave this, one additional observation. The phrase, who reject me, and of course, the who are blessed, these phrases can modify, grammatically, either the fathers or the children or both together. Now, the fact that those who reject me can modify either means the statement should not automatically be read as some generational curse that will make the godly suffer. Okay, yes, sin has consequences, but this is consequences for what other people do. Your suffering has nothing to do with your own individual eternal destiny and the way the Lord looks at you and your heart. These are two distinct things. Stop conflating them and stop believing lies and start believing what's true. Again, believing loyalty. There we are. We're back to square one again. Now, Sarna adds this. It is important to note that the statement in the Decalogue concerning the generational extension of punishment has nothing whatsoever to do with the administration of justice in Israel's legal system. There, vicarious punishment is never mandated. Indeed, it is explicitly outlawed in Deuteronomy 24:16. Quote, fathers shall not be put to death because of their children, nor shall children be put to death because of their fathers. Each one shall be put to death for his own sin. Now, here's the question. Here's why I bring it up. If God's not even thinking that way, like your fate is sealed now because of what somebody else did, this is your lot, okay? If God's not thinking of that even in his own legal system that he gives Israel, why do you suppose he would think about that in terms of your spiritual everlasting destiny? It just makes no sense. And so stop believing lies. This is theocratic covenantal language in context. It has nothing to do, again, with our eternal destiny. So on to Exodus 20, verse 7. Next command. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Now, as I've noted a number of times, again, sort of just recently in some of the talks I've done that are on YouTube and so on and so forth, the word take here is Hebrew nasa. It means to bear, like in lifting up, to carry. The idea of bearing the name, taking the name, carrying the name, the idea is representational. Yes, okay, that's going to encompass speech that is disrespectful or makes God's name of no consequence or the object of contempt. I mean, that's part of bearing the name. But bearing the name is much bigger. It's also about imaging. Fundamentally, it's about imaging. To bear the name, to carry the name, is about representing God. It's about imaging God. The name, again, this is unseen realm territory again, doing biblical theology in that book, the name refers to the person. Hashem, the name, is another way of referring to God himself. It's not just, hey, don't like say the four consonants in a frivolous manner. Okay, that's part of it. If you're treating the name frivolously, that means you're treating God frivolously. But it's bigger than that, okay? Bearing the name in a frivolous way, bearing the name, let's talk about in vain. In vain can mean falsely, like you have a false profession, false representation. Leviticus 19:12, you shall not swear by my name falsely, and so profane the name of the Lord your God, or your God, I am the Lord. So it can be like lying, okay, just do a false representation. In vain can also mean worthless, bearing the name worthlessly or uselessly, behaving in such a way that you equate the name, that you equate God himself with nothing, with something of no consequence, you equate God with an insubstantial thing, making him of no consequence. Again, that's much more wide than just what comes out of your mouth. But again, the in vain idea, the Hebrew wording here can mean, again, just this, making something insubstantial or inconsequential. 1 Samuel 25:21. Now David had said, surely in vain have I guarded all that this fellow has in the wilderness. Like, well, this was a useless exercise. So again, in vain there, again, it refers to something that just is useless, having no consequence. It's lashav in Hebrew. Jeremiah 2:30. In vain have I struck your children. They took no correction. Your own sword devoured your prophets like a ravening lion. Against Jeremiah, it's on the impending invasion of Nebuchadnezzar. So this was useless activity. You get the idea. Now we actually, I think, have easy ways to illustrate this, how bearing the name is representational. It's another way of talking about imaging God, being God's proxy. And for an Israelite, again, they're supposed to be the kingdom of priests, right? They're supposed to be a holy people, kingdom of priests. They're supposed to represent their God well. But we have this idea today, like we talk about bearing the family name or bearing the company name. Like when I worked, with Logos, we would go to, different events and, you'd wear the shirt with the logo and all that kind of stuff, So you go out and you are a representative of the company. So that if you're a jerk, that means that people are going to perceive the company in a negative way. Anyone who has a job or, considers the reputation of their family important is going to get this idea immediately. You don't do certain things because that brings shame, or it brings, it puts the thing you represent, family, company, whatever, in this case, your God, it gives it ill repute. It lowers opinion. Okay, it makes inconsequential something that should be of great consequence. Now, Wenham, I like what he says here. He writes, this commandment is couched in language deliberately chosen to permit a wide range of application, covering every dimension of the misuse of Yahweh's name. So, he says it's really broad. Yahweh had not withheld his name, but had freely given it to Moses, and so to Israel, as both a summary and an extension of the revelation of his presence. His sovereignty is such that he was not subject to the manipulation of his worshippers, and thus he opened himself to his people with as much fullness as they could stand. Not surprisingly, there are no incantation texts in the Old Testament. Yahweh could not be controlled or even altered in his set purpose by men. The third commandment is directed not toward Yahweh's protection, but toward Israel's. Yahweh's name, especially the Tetragrammaton, but in principle all of Yahweh's names and titles, must be honored, blessed, praised, celebrated, invoked, pronounced, and so shared. And I would add, believed in. To treat Yahweh's name with disrespect is to treat his gift lightly. His gift is himself, okay? It is to underestimate his power, to scorn his presence, and to misrepresent to the family of humankind his very nature as the one who always is. That's the end of Wenham's quote. Again, to bear the name, bear the name uselessly, bear the name in vain, bear the name poorly. It's about imaging God. It's about representation. And it's really important. It ties, back in again to Genesis. Now, for those of you coming to the Naked Bible Conference, you're going to hear a little bit more about this, because this is going to be the topic related to the topic that Carmen Imes is going to be talking about, because she did her dissertation on this. So this is something that is a really significant part of biblical theology. So if you're at the conference, you're going to get a good dose of it from Carmen. The next command, Exodus 20, verses 8 through 10. Let's read that. Exodus 20, verses 8 through 10. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Now back to Wenham. I'm going to read something from Wenham and then Carpenter, their commentaries. Wenham says, the fourth commandment is the longest in the Decalogue because it is the most expanded of all the commandments. No other commandment has received as much reapplication and as many defining and justifying clauses as this one. The probable reason for its expansion is the difficulty the people of Israel had keeping it, a difficulty attested by the attack of Amos in Amos 8, 4 through 8, on the greedy merchants fidgeting for the Sabbath to pass. I mean, that's the end of the Wenham quote. I mean, if you're one of these merchants, I can't wait for the Sabbath to pass so I can make money. You've just really missed the point. You've really missed the point of what it means. Now, Carpenter writes this: the Sabbath, or the seventh day, as a day of rest and a test for Israel's commitment to keep the way of Yahweh, had already been described in Exodus 16, verse 5 and 21 through 30. That was the manna incident. Now it is placed under the broader canopy of the covenant and within the context of the 10 words at Sinai. It has no parallel in the ancient Near East, as Hallow, that's Hallo, has shown definitively. Now, that's the end of Carpenter's quote. And the study he's referencing, I have put this article in the protected folder. So if you're a newsletter subscriber, McLeod newsletter subscriber, you can get access to these articles. It's William W. Hallow, and the title of the article is New Moons and Sabbaths, a Case Study in the Contrastive Approach. That's from Hebrew Union College Annual, number 48, 1977, and it's an 18-page article. Now, Hallow, for many years, was a professor of Akkadian and Sumerian at Yale. In his day, Hallow was one of the voices, the top dogs in cuneiform studies. He was also a champion of the comparative approach, the legitimacy of how cuneiform material, Akkadian, Babylonian, Sumerian, all that stuff could enlighten our reading of the Hebrew Bible, and even a little bit, give and take, even vice versa. Okay, so he was big on the comparative method. He was a champion of it, and he had critics, obviously, who didn't like the fact that any other literature out there might sort of endorse what's in the Bible, might actually show that, the biblical writer knew what he was talking about here. So Hallow had critics in his day, in 60s, 70s, 80s. That was his period when people were especially attacking biblical archaeology, an attack that is still ongoing. But in this article, he noticed the subtitle, A Case Study in the Contrastive Approach. Not comparative, but contrastive. In his article, he talks about, the importance of the comparative method, but he says, today we're going to look at something that's actually contrastive. And it's an important study because he goes through, again, Akkadian and Babylonian material about 7-day, festivals and even the terminology, and says, look, none of this aligns well or really even coherently with the Sabbath. The Sabbath is unique. And I think it's an important article because out there on wacky internet land, again, Middle Earth, this is going to be one of those things where, yeah, even the Sabbath, the Jews and their Sabbath, even the Sabbath, they stole that from the Babylon. No. Okay? It just doesn't work. And so I want to give you a good resource to refute nonsense. This is what we like to do here. Let me read you a little bit of a selection from the New International Dictionary of Old Testament Theology and Exegesis. That's a premier word study resource. And it's the entry on Shabbat and Shabbaton, is the noun, but Shabbat the verb. The entry says this in part: although a cognate exists in Aramaic and Syriac, Shabbatah, it is unlikely that the Hebrew nominative Shabbat, the middle consonant being doubled. If you have Hebrew, it's the dagesh, the dot. Yeah, so it's in English it'd be Shabbat, Shabbat. Okay. It is unlikely that the Hebrew nominative Shabbat with the middle consonant doubled can be derived from the Akkadian term Shabatu or Shapatu, which means the 15th day or the full moon day, because of the doubled last consonant of the latter, of the Akkadian term. Now, if you haven't had Hebrew or Semitic languages, or something of comparative morphology and all that kind of stuff, you're not going to get that. But basically, I'll try to decipher this. In Hebrew, the third consonant is doubled, Shabbat. In the Akkadian, it's the last consonant that's doubled. There is no way linguistically, etymologically, to account for the difference. And so Hallow, again, he would agree with this. The NIDOTTE entry is going to be dipping into Akkadian stuff. The one term does not mean the other. The one term does not derive from the other. Linguistically, etymologically, you can't make the case. Okay, that's what the entry's drawing on here. Back to the entry. It says, there is also uncertainty about the possible connection between Shabbat and the Akkadian seventh, Shibbatim, and that does have the double B. The Hebrew for seven is Shavah, and there has been no convincing explanation as to why the final consonants changed. So the Akkadian word for seven or seventh is SHB, and it would double the B, T. The Hebrew for seven is SHB Ghayan. It's not a T. And there is no linguistic interchange between Ghayan, that last consonant, looks like a backwards Y, and T. So again, even this is, again, I'm pointing this out because this is what you're going to hear on the internet. This is what you're going to read on the internet. Well, the Akkadian word for seven is, spelled like Hebrew Shabbat. Yeah, it is, but you're overlooking the fact that Hebrew 7 isn't the same word. And when you get the thing that's actually calendrical, the Akkadian term that refers to the calendar pattern, Shabatu or Shapatu, that doesn't align with Shabbat because of the doubling of different consonants. Again, linguistics matter, comparative linguistics matter, comparative philology and etymology matters. I realize in internet land it doesn't matter. And you're going to be deceived by what looks like a visual similarity that actually, if you knew, again, how to work with the languages, you would see that these aren't the same. But in internet land, they're close enough. People can be duped, and they are duped into thinking that one thing derived from the other when it actually didn't. So again, I'm trying to give you resources here and alert you to the fact that when you see this kind of stuff online, don't buy into it. Don't buy into it. The people who actually work with the languages know that it's nonsense. And I sure wish more of them would comment on the nonsense, but hey, there we are. Now, back to the entry. Let's just wrap it up here. Despite inconclusive ancient Near Eastern comparative evidence and fruitless etymological speculation, sevenfold chronological divisions can be found in Ugaritic texts. There's 7 years in the Donnell cycle. 7 years is mentioned. 7 days in the Kirta legend. But the entry goes on, this does not presuppose any universal sevenfold chronology in the ancient Near East. There just isn't any, except for the Sabbath. All it does indicate a certain tendency to use a sevenfold division for whatever reason. And Hallow, that's the end of the quote, Hallow would say, there was just a fondness for the number 7. So you see it pop up here and there. But there's no system in the ancient Near East of having a unit of time, a 7 unit of time that is more than just a singular event. There's no annual 7 cycles. There's no annual Jubilee pattern cycles anywhere else except in Israel. This is just the fact. Okay, this is just the fact. But again, out there in the internet, you'll read and hear other things to the contrary, and they are misinformed. So for our purposes, I'm not going to fill the episode with more speculations. This is where we're going to drop it. Again, try to get you the resources and just to at least alert you to the fact that, hey, Assyriologists, people who are serious, Akkadian, Babylonian, Sumerian experts like Hallow, again, who taught at Yale for many years, they're not persuaded at all that the Israelite Sabbath derives from anything else in the ancient Near East. Now, recall, since we brought up Exodus 16, Exodus 16, the manna incident, was the first time in the Torah that the noun Sabbath, the noun, occurred. Shabbat, it occurs 4 times there. So, again, if you concorded it, you're not going to see Sabbath, the noun, back in Genesis. The first time you ever see it is Exodus 16. The verb rest, Shabbat, the verb, of course, does occur in Genesis. It does occur in the creation account. And Hallow, again, who is cited in Carpenter, so this is really quoting Carpenter, but he's citing Hallow, argues as follows. The sabbatical idea of Israel permeated the legislation of Israel, and the building of the sacred tabernacle was not to impinge on this holy day. As one of 2 positive commands, it promises great benefit to those who honor the Sabbath with awareness that Yahweh is Lord over this holy time in a special way. The recognition of the day is not, in this motive clause, tied to nature or to human culture, but is linked to creation and creator. At creation, Yahweh first hallowed this Sabbath, again, because he rested, because on it he ceased from his labor. The Sabbath for Israel and in the scheme of creation itself was a part of the texture of God's created order, an essential part of the matrix of reality. Now, Deuteronomy 5:15, of course, links the Sabbath to the deliverance from Egypt. So there's other sort of context and motivations for Sabbath. But it's kind of interesting that on one hand, the Sabbath is linked to the resting of God in creation. Like it's just part of the fabric, the matrix of reality, as Carpenter says. And then on another hand, it's linked to taking Israel out of bondage. Carpenter writes this: Yahweh had redeemed Israel from their slavery in Egypt. This is a new act of creation. For the people of God were created anew at the Exodus event. All social classes and even animals were to be allowed to observe the Sabbath. It was a gracious gift. The Israelites affirmed Yahweh as their God, their Redeemer, and Creator on a weekly basis by keeping this day. It's the end of Carpenter. So there's actually a connection. Why is it that the Sabbath, is linked not only back to creation in Exodus, but in Deuteronomy, it's also linked back to, the removal of Israel from Egypt, because God is created. It's a supernatural act of creation. It's creating a people. It's a recreation of God's family on earth. And it is miraculous because why? Because look how it was accomplished. The plagues, control of the Creator over creation, defeat of the gods of Egypt. And out of all that, again, comes this people. So it is perceived by the Israelites, by the biblical writers, as being connected, the creative idea and the new national status idea. These are ideas that are connected. Now, I would suggest to you, this is in part why Jesus could refer to himself as the Lord of the Sabbath. Why? What's the logic? He was the Passover lamb and the new redeemer of God's people. And I would even add, if the destroying angel at the last plague is in fact the angel of Yahweh, the son, as it were, in human form, okay, in visible human form, okay. If that's the case, then he was also Egypt's judge as well. I mean, you could have Jesus being performing, even foreshadowing his role as judge of evil. And isn't it interesting that we get the Egyptian plagues in the book of Revelation? I'll just stop there because I'm not into eschatology, but there we go. I mean, literarily speaking, theologically speaking, there might be a connection there, and I would suggest there is. Connecting all these things again to Jesus. Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath because he is the new Redeemer out of bondage. He is the agent of creation in New Testament theology. Okay, he's linked back to the God of Sabbath by these things, and so he can rightly say, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Carpenter adds another thought. God did not circumcise his sacred day of rest. His people were then and now at Sinai invited to enter into that holy time and space to share it with their Redeemer, Creator God. Now, what he's getting at here is, if you think back to Genesis, the seventh day, God rests, and this is like God is now in the state of resting. He's done with creation. He's now in the state of resting. So, in theory, the seventh day, the time of rest extends, indefinitely, which is again part of the logic as to why it was a thing to be remembered again, and it was cyclical throughout all time, not just some isolated individual feast or festival. Okay, he doesn't limit it. God did not circumscribe his sacred day of rest. His people were then and now at Sinai invited to enter into that holy time and space and to share it with their Redeemer, Creator God. Von Rad and recently Walt Heiser have emphasized this much neglected theme in Old Testament and New Testament theology. The ultimate rest for God's people is realized when his presence dwells among them. See, that's really, when you rest on the Sabbath, okay, you're supposed to be sort of picturing yourself at home with the Lord, because the earth is God's temple. Back in Genesis and creation, God has made himself a place to live. He's made earth, which is fit for human habitation, but he's also made Eden, the divine abode. Okay, so heaven is going to come to earth, and he's going to rest there. He's going to have family time now. He's going to enjoy this. And so you're supposed to be thinking in that mode. Again, you're invited to think in that mode, to join God in his rest when you do this, okay? The ultimate rest, again, back to Carpenter, for God's people is realized when his presence dwells among them. He will dwell among them in the wilderness and the tabernacle in a more permanent way than in the pillars of fire and cloud, and more so when he plants them in his prepared location, the land, the place where God will choose to set his name. Exodus advances this theme significantly and maintains the promises to the fathers and looks to the future. Israel's rest of shalom had historical goals, but these goals expanded to include eschatological parameters and are ultimately realized in the New Testament and even later in the new heavens and new earth through Christ. And again, the book of Hebrews, dealt with this a lot, entering into God's rest. And our rest is Jesus. Again, we go back to the series in Hebrews. Yahweh's new people are commanded again to enter into a closer relationship with him by observing his Sabbath. His call is a call to begin to restore the image of God in persons by imaging his own behavior. But to redeem fallen humanity, he had to interrupt and work on his seventh day, to deliver his people. To save life on the Sabbath was good. The observance of the Sabbath by Israel was a clear mark that they were the newly created people of Yahweh, on whom he was once again conferring his guidance in the way of holiness, righteousness, love, and wisdom. That's the end of the Carpenter quote. Now, again, his rest was interrupted. He had to go back to action in Egypt and rescue his people. Now that they're out, now we have rest again. That's the whole point. I would suggest as well that this provides some context for Jesus' statement that the Sabbath was created for man and not man for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was created for man. The rest is what it is so that God's family can be with him at rest in his house, in his world. Okay, man wasn't created for that. That was created for man. Pete ends, and we're going to end with this. He has a nice summary section here. He writes this: "This is a reconnection with the Garden of Eden as Israel sits poised to enter the land of Canaan, the new garden. As God ordered the universe in Genesis 1, he is now giving Israel order in its existence amid the chaos of the world around them. By resting on the seventh day, Israel is not just following God's command, but actually following God's lead, his example. They are doing what he himself did first. This pattern, therefore, is not a burden, but a delight and a high honor. By ceasing his own work on the seventh day, God declared it to be different, separate, or as the commandment puts it, holy. The Israelites too are to keep it holy, verse 8, by remembering it. The first 4 commandments concern our conduct toward God. The remaining 6 are conduct toward others. But we should not force too sharp a distinction between these two foci, as if the first 4 are religious and the last 6 social or ethical. The laws concerning conduct toward others are still commands from God. They are still his laws, so that breaking any commandment, even one against a fellow Israelite, is an offense toward God. That is, there is no sphere in ancient Israel life that is secular, or, this is me adding it, without God. And I think that's really a nice summary, and sort of creates a segue to part 3 when we get into those last 6 commands. But I really like the notion of looking at the Sabbath, and really, all these laws, because bearing the name is about, just think of it. I'm the Lord your God who brought you up out of Egypt. Okay, don't make graven images. Okay, God cannot be represented adequately by anything in creation. He is other than creation. He is uncreated. Consequently, you must not bow down to anything made with human hands. You only bow down to the uncreated Creator, who is your God, entering into covenant with you, Yahweh of Israel. Okay, look at that. That has to do with images. Imaging. It's the wrong use of imaging. And then it transitions, to bearing the name. That's imaging. It's representation. And now we've got Sabbath. We imitate God. We image God. The imaging and the law, these things are really tied together. And then you get the last 6, how you treat other people. Who are other people? Imagers. How you treat other imagers. So this is a really big deal. Again, and I think it's worth pointing out because, again, we typically look at the law as something either to earn brownie points with God, to put God in our debt, or some kind of ridiculous burden, or, God forbid, thank God I don't live under the law. A godly Israelite wouldn't look at it that way. This is our chance to imitate God, to image him, to represent him, to be his proxy to people who don't know him, and to treat each other well. That was the law. It doesn't sound too bad when you actually look at it the way it should be looked at. Not as a system of bondage where, look, we're humans. We want autonomy. We don't like anyone telling us what to do. It's part of the flesh, okay? But if you actually look at what the law was supposed to mean, it's not a system where you earn God's love. God already loves you. You're in his family. You're supposed to believe and be loyal. Show that you believe, that God loves you. Show that you believe that God is who he is by the way you live. Treat him well, treat everybody else well. Again, the law, like Jesus said, you can reduce it all to 2 things: love God and love your fellow man. It's not burdensome when it's perceived and sort of enacted in the right way. But that isn't what people do. It's not what humans do. We tend to basically ruin everything we touch. And here we go again. This is why Paul could say the law was holy and just and good. But again, it makes us aware of our need to be saved, by an external savior, God, Christ, So it serves that purpose as well, ultimately because we're fallen. But in and of itself, in principle, again, I think we need to try to not lose sight of what it really meant. And I think tying it to imaging will help us do that.
All right, Mike. Well, this week, part 3, is this the final part of Exodus 20?
This is the final part, yes, for Exodus 20. So, yep, it took us 3 times to get through it. We got 6 commands to cover today, so we're going to be here a little while. But I think people will find this interesting because, on the one hand, you kind of assume that they're pretty straightforward, and some of them are. But then there are others that are a little difficult to define, and there are even exceptions, biblical exceptions to some of the commands. So that is often new. I remember when I taught, ethics, we would, spend, a day at least on 10 commandments, and people were surprised that there were actually, again, exceptions sort of built into them. And we've actually seen that already in the previous part 2, when we got into the first 4 commands, where we had the command about not making graven images, idols, so to speak, or an image of anything, in the heavens above and on the earth and under the earth and all that. Well, then a few chapters later, God commands that cherubim be made, or even the menorah, the golden lampstand. You could lump that in here too. So these are religious objects, certainly of things on the earth, or in the heavens above the earth, in the case of the cherubim. So how is that not a violation, of the command? Well, it wasn't a violation, as we saw last time, because the real issue was, Israelites were not to bow down to or worship any of them. They were to bow down only to the uncreated Creator. And God Himself shows up. I mean, this isn't like fashioning anything, but God does show up as a man, which is, of course, is certainly an earthly thing. And so God is in, human form. How is that consistent, you might say, with this idea that God is unrepresentable, in these commands, these early commands. So, we talked about that last time, that here you have what seems to be kind of clear cut, but then you've got these other things that sort of impede on it, that require some unpacking to show, really to learn, well, what was the real basis, for the command here. And we're going to get that again today with some of these commands, not all of them, but some of them. So the real takeaway here is that the 10 commandments themselves actually have context. They're not just sort of dropped in our laps and there's nothing to think about here. There's actually plenty to think about in a number of instances. So they have a context in which they themselves need to be understood. Mostly it's a wider context that, once you get into the wider context, it reveals, some exceptions, or helps you sort of narrow down what the command actually means, what the point was. And so that's often new to people. And we're going to see more of that today. So we might as well just jump right in with the 5th command. This is going to be Exodus 20, verse 12, is really our starting point, where it says, "Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you." So this is the 5th command. Asarna, who we have referenced before, and we will reference several times today in his Jewish Publication Society commentary on Exodus, has, again, I think, a good summary. I really like, Sarna's commentary in a number of respects. He writes this: "This command forms the transition from the first to the second group of divine declarations, in that it simultaneously possesses both religious and social dimensions. It shares with the preceding command the formula, the Lord your God, and also the relationship of Israel to God is often expressed metaphorically in filial terms, like in family terms. Let me just break in here. We have this honor your father and your mother, and then that's linked to the land that the Lord your God is giving you. So there's this sort of boots on the ground kind of thing. It has to do with your relationships one to another, but there's also this overarching relationship to God expressed in the land. And this isn't new. At Exodus 4:22, This is the passage where, God refers to Israel as his son. Okay, so there you have like a family sort of terminology there. Jeremiah 31:20, is Ephraim my dear son? Question, is he my darling child? These are rhetorical questions. Hosea 11:1, when Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son, and so on and so forth. So you get this family language where ultimately what's being talked about is the relationship of God, and then the covenant promises, one of which was the land, so on and so forth. So you get a little bit of that here. Back to Sarna, he says the same verbs of honoring and revering are used in expressing proper human attitudes to both God and parents. So the same verbs in the Hebrew Bible are used to both how you relate to parents and how you relate to God. So this command is sort of a bridge of the two halves, even though they're not equal halves of the commands. The first four and then the next six: relationship to God, relationship to other imagers, other people. So just by way of example, Exodus 21:17, whoever curses his father or his mother shall be put to death. So there you have a very obvious one about revering parents. Leviticus 29 is the same way. Deuteronomy 21, again, about the rebellious son. We're going to get into some of these, where it talks about relating, to parents in a certain way. But you also get the same kind of language in Leviticus 24. Those were laws about blaspheming God. Earlier, the one I just read and some of that I just referenced are about, to use, for lack of a better way to put it, not blaspheming or not, cursing your parents. Well, the same language is used of God, like in Leviticus 24, Numbers 15, and so on. So we get the language in both, which, as Sarna is pointing out, is kind of a bridge between the two halves. He writes, in fact, the obligation to respect is enjoined only for God and parents, and the offender in either instance is liable to the extreme penalty. The parallels point up the supreme importance that the Torah assigns to the integrity of the family for the sake of the stability of society and generational continuity. Family life is the bedrock on which Jewish society stands. No other item in the Decalogue is similarly formulated wholly in positive terms, and for none other is there a promise of reward. So this one, the fifth command, honor your father and mother, there's some special characteristics to it that link that command to the way we should revere and honor God. Now, a few comments here, just to sort of get into the weeds. You have and honor your father and mother. There's no hint here. If you really think about it, there's no hint that the command has a time limit. Just says, honor your father and mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. It doesn't say honor your father and mother until, and then there's some limit. Okay, there's no hint that the command has a time limit. There's no hint that it expires when children reach a certain age, or that one parent is valued above the other. Again, Sarna notes elsewhere the command applies equally to son and daughter, irrespective of their age, and it holds for both parents, end of quote. So the question, of course, is what does honor mean? Does it mean obey in every circumstance? Now, we get a little help here from other verses in the Torah that speak to the treatment of parents, one of which I've already, quoted a little bit, but Exodus 21:15, that's the one we quoted, whoever strikes his father or mother shall be put to death. Leviticus 20, verse 9, anyone who curses his father and his mother shall surely be put to death. He has cursed his father or his mother, his blood is upon him. Now, the verb for cursing there, in Hebrew, it's the lemma kalal, and it's in something called the PL stem. Now, the PL stem, sorry for the little Hebrew grammar digression here, is often characterized by grammarians as factative in its semantic. And what factative means is that it points, you would have a verb that when the action of the verb is performed, it leads to a certain specific end result. So in this case, since the verb for curse is put in this particular Hebrew stem, that has the end result in mind, often in its semantics. The idea is that cursing your parents results in their being put in a state of being demeaned or humiliated. Okay, this is what you're not supposed to do. Leviticus 19:3 reads as follows: "Every one of you shall revere his mother and his father, and you shall keep my Sabbaths. I am the Lord." Revere here is the Hebrew word yarah, which means generically to fear. We get the verb in Leviticus 19:30. Again, just to reference that, you shall keep my Sabbaths and reverence my sanctuary. Okay. Leviticus 26:2, also referencing the sanctuary. So are we really, are Israelites really supposed to be afraid of the sanctuary? No, they're supposed to revere it. That revere is a good translation. You're supposed to avoid desecrating it. You're supposed to avoid, defiling it in any way, bringing sacred space into a state of being common. Okay, lowering it, bringing it down, making it low, demeaning it. So revere is actually a pretty good, translation. So this is what we're not supposed to be doing to parents. Deuteronomy 27:16, we get a different verb, kala, which means to degrade, despise, or treat with contempt. And that verse says, "Cursed be anyone who dishonors," kala, his father or his mother. So this helps us, get some sort of a framework, for how these verbs are used in the fifth command. Don't humiliate, don't do the opposite of revere. Don't demean. Okay, this is what you're not supposed to do. Don't bring your parents down, bring them low. They're supposed to be treated as special. It's the same verbs that you would use for treating God. So don't treat them as common, like everybody else, so that they're humiliated and demeaned or whatnot. So, we need to sort of have those things in mind. Let Scripture, as best we can, try to define Scripture. The other factor that we need to think about is the Bible's own view of marriage and how this sort of works out in biblical history. You have the leave and cleave language of Genesis, for instance. A man will leave, his father and mother. You leave his, one family, and then be, cleave to his wife, and then of course start a new family. Well, again, just because you're married and you have a new family unit, that doesn't excuse you from the fifth command. Again, you just read it; it's pretty straightforward. There are no limitations or exceptions, and so on and so forth. But we still don't quite know what the command means to honor your father and mother. Like, how do we do that, and how do we transgress that? How would we know? So I bring up the leave and cleave thing because, yeah, it establishes a new family unit, but in Israelite culture, even in urban settings, when they're actually living in cities, as opposed to patriarchal, when they're living in tents, okay? Even in urban settings, the new family units typically in the patriarchal era lived in the same tent. They lived under the same tent roof. You just essentially added to the tent or partitioned it off so that the man and his wife now have their own space, within the patriarch's tent, his house, as it were. Or, as the parents aged, they weren't sent off, to some other, living accommodation. They stayed with the family, either in the same tent or in the same house, again, when we're in an urban setting. So you often have parents living in the home, parents and these other units, these other family units living together. It's an extended family living situation. And, even when the leadership of the family or the clan passes on to the eldest son or whoever, has the right of the firstborn conferred to them, okay? Even in that situation, the parents are still going to be there. So you have the presence of both one or both parents in the home, and that kind of changes the dynamic, or at least it's a factor that needs to be considered. Regardless, of who has leadership, of the family or the clan, the parents were not supposed to be demeaned or belittled. Again, even when some other son, effectively ran the home and the family's property, the parents, especially the father, had reverential leadership status. Now, in our day and age, really in modern society in general, the circumstances are often quite different. Those set of circumstances really aren't going to play out, at least in modern Western society, really in the same way. So there is a different dynamic here. Let's take another, angle at this. So we've got kind of what the verbiage means: don't demean, don't humiliate, don't belittle. Again, treat as special. It's stated positively. We've got a situation where that's what the words mean. There's no limitations or exceptions in the command. The dynamic is a little bit unfamiliar to us because the parents basically stay with the children and the children with the parents really their whole lives. Another bit of a rabbit trail. Well, let's look at it at a different way. There is one passage, the Deuteronomy 21 passage. This is Deuteronomy 21, 18 to 21, where the command apparently does mean obey the parent, where the child is supposed to obey the parent. And we actually have an adult child in the context. So we need to factor this in as well. So let me read Deuteronomy 21, 18 through 21. This is obviously a negative example. But it says, if a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, and though they discipline him, will not listen to them, then his father and his mother shall take hold of him and bring him out to the elders of his city at the gate of the place where he lives. And they shall say to the elders of his city, This our son is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the men of the city shall stone him to death with stones. So you shall purge the evil from your midst, and all Israel shall hear and fear. It's like, yeah, I guess they would. Now, the context there seems to be one where the son is an adult, at least a young adult, because he's referred to as getting drunk. He's a drunkenness problem. And the son is undermining the family unit by being a drain on resources or just refusing correction. He's not a little kid where they could chastise him in some, physical way or isolate him in some way or take away privileges, that kind of thing. We have what seems to be an adult relationship here, an adult child. Because of the emphasis in other passages in regard to the prohibition of demeaning parents or treating them with contempt, we might presume that, obviously this is what's going on here. I mean, why else would they essentially have to take him to the law, as it were? They're being treated with contempt. This is part of the picture. So the parents in this case do not take matters into their own hands, but instead they take the son to the tribal elders, which in effect in Israel was law enforcement, and put his fate, the son's fate, into their hands. They turn him over. And now the legal system's going to do with him what the legal system does. We, of course, today might have to do the same thing, with a child. In other words, let the legal system handle that kid. And they might do something where, going to law enforcement is appropriate and merited. The passage is therefore an endorsement of the idea that parents may need to resort to these means, to law enforcement. It's not an endorsement of the system of law enforcement or the penalty. It's an endorsement of the idea that, hey, when you have an adult son like this who's, again, treating you with contempt, you may have to just take them to the authorities and let the authorities deal with him. Now, we aren't a theocratic state, obviously, and the theocracy was by definition, I've said this a number of times in the podcast, the theocracy was by definition planned to be obsolete. It's planned obsolescence. At least if we care to think about where all the covenants were supposed to lead, to the reunification of the nations, which meant a circumcision-neutral people of God brought back into the family through a Savior, which is Jesus, okay? This is where salvation history was always supposed to go. The theocracy is sort of a way station along the road to, that God is intending here. So God's plan was never to reinstitute or to institute a theocracy that would endure for all time, and that's how things are going to go now. No, it was supposed to lead somewhere. The theocracy was a stopping point, a way station. And even as far back as the Abrahamic covenant, the Gentiles were in the picture. Jacob's blessing in Genesis 48, okay, through which we talked about, in earlier episodes about the reference to Ephraim. The Gentiles were supposed to be part of this. So from the very beginning, the plan was not an Israelite theocracy. So to say that God ordained a theocracy, and this is God's ordained form of the way that his kingdom family is supposed to be on earth, is wrong. You basically have to ignore not only the way salvation history played out, you have to ignore the way it was intended to play out. That's my point here. So I continually, kind of go back to this because we get stuck on these passages like, oh, well, unless we turn our kids over and the kid gets capital punishment, we're not obeying the Bible. Well, again, just rip that thing out of context and pretend a theocracy was, supposed to be, the way things were supposed to, play out in God's plan. Let's just pretend that. It's wrong. Okay, it's just wrong-headed, it's misguided, it's out of context interpretation. So what we have here is not an endorsement of a particular culture or even a particular form of government that God was at one point behind. What we have here is an endorsement of the idea that parents may actually have to let somebody else deal with their kids. That's what it is. We're at that point now. This is an important principle that the Torah, okay, the Bible, the wider Bible, does not endorse a specific culture. Hebrew culture, okay, and I realize I'm striking at the Hebrew roots people, and I don't mind doing that because they're wrong-headed. All right, here, God does not endorse theocracy for the church, for his, for believers through all time. Well, it's the Torah. Well, yeah, I know it's the Torah. If you read the Torah, like Genesis 48 and Genesis 12, you would know that Gentile inclusion was always in the picture. You would know that. And Gentile inclusion is a circumcision neutral thing. Because elsewhere in the Bible, we have Gentiles becoming priests of the Most High. This is all part of the picture. So to pick one period of Israelite history and one facet of salvation history, in this case theocracy, and say this is the way God wanted it from the beginning to the end, it's just wrong. It just is. And so that's important when you get into things like the commands, and because the commands are the foundation for ethics. And the whole issue of, now that we have the church now, which is a circumcision neutral thing, what are we supposed to do with the Torah? And the Torah was planned obsolescence, the theocracy. Now, the moral laws of the Torah get carried into the New Testament. We know that. That makes sense because it's just morality. But the specific laws of the theocracy do not, because they are bound, tied to, they are operative within a theocratic state, which was never the designed endpoint. Again, so this is important. I would say this in regard to honoring the father and the mother, again, having gone on that little rabbit trail. But again, that's going to help us, at some points in the rest of the episode. The command, to honor the father and the mother may not have a scriptural limit, but it does have practical limits. So we need to get real here. And, what I'm going to say here would have been logically applied, in the theocratic state as well. People kind of know when, let's say, the parents are just not functioning like they are, like they should be. There might be a health problem, something like that. People are people. We try to not treat parents with contempt. We want to make sure they're not belittled. This is what these verbs mean in the command. They don't mean to obey at all times in every circumstance, regardless of how absurd or abhorrent it might be. So let's get real. The command wasn't given so that a parent or parents with dementia would have to be obeyed, no matter how irrational they have become. That's just real life. If your parent in Israelite society is commanding you to sin, sorry. But the fifth command, and no command of God, I will add, is given so that you enable evil to proliferate. No command is given so that evil gets help. And that is not the point of any command, including the Ten Commandments. And when we have a situation where, someone is obviously debilitated, okay, this is real life. It doesn't, the command doesn't require slavish obedience by children when a parent wants to do evil or wants the child to do evil. The first authority is God, and God is omniscient. God actually knows when it's in a parent's best interest to not let that parent have authority. God knows the circumstances. He's not surprised by any of these things. Sometimes we read these commands, again, as if they require us to check our brain in at the door or ignore a real life circumstance. God knows the circumstances you are in. So, I know believers often struggle with this, how to honor a parent's wishes. When do I say no to a parent? Because I just know that if I say yes, it's going to really be bad. It's going to be destructive, not only to my parents, but to somebody else. What do I do? Again, God knows the circumstances. He's not learning anything when he looks at your situation. He knows. He knows the circumstances you're in. He knows the motivation of your heart as well. And sometimes to honor a parent means making a decision contrary to their wishes. Just like as a parent, sometimes letting a child suffer the circumstances of their behavior is the best thing in the long-term interest of the child. So having the best interest of the parent in mind is what the command is really about. That is honoring the parent. That is making them, giving them the benefit of the doubt in every way possible. We are not treating them like they're some ordinary person. They have special status. This is why we're struggling with the decision. If it was somebody else, we wouldn't struggle at all. Okay, we're struggling with the decision because this is our parent or parents. We're trying to make the best decision for them. God knows the real motivation in our heart. He knows the things that we say and don't say that are just floating around in our head. God knows all that. So we do need to be careful about the decisions we make in regard to parents, especially when they get to a certain stage in life, because God does know, and we will be accountable, either in this life, or we will suffer loss, when it comes to reward in heaven because of the decisions we make. I mean, we're not going to get away with anything is the point. So we do need to be careful. We need to do the best job we can to honor them. But sometimes the best way to honor them is to say no or come up with some alternative. And God knows that. Again, God isn't learning anything here. God actually knows the circumstances, and he knows what's in your heart. He sees everything, and he knows everything. He knows if you're really acting in self-interest. He knows if you're taking pleasure in your parents' displeasure. He knows all that. God is not fooled, and he will not be mocked. So the bottom line is that this command, which doesn't expire, speaks not of handing absolute dictatorial authority to parents no matter their situation or no matter what they want. That isn't the point. Rather, it speaks of not belittling or demeaning them, treating them in the best way possible with the circumstances being what they are. Don't treat them with contempt. Treat them well as best you can, God being your witness. And that's tough sometimes. Let's move on to command number 6. You shall not murder. This is Exodus 20:13. Now that's the ESV. The exceptions in this command are discernible by virtue of that translation. You shall not murder, as opposed to other translations that say something like you shall not kill. Now, if you're going to translate the verse you shall not kill, that produces conundrums or conundra. When you look at the rest of the Bible does command taking the lives of animals, for instance, sacrifice. If you're going to, thou shalt not, I've actually heard people say, thou shalt not kill, we need to be vegan, thou shalt not kill. Well, does that really what the command means? Because God actually did command sacrifices. So you got a problem here, dude. God also commands taking human life in war, or the life of anyone who has committed a capital crime, both within Israel and even before we get to the theocracy. Now, Sarna nicely summarizes why murder, which is the taking of an innocent life, a life that has done nothing deserving of death in a legal sense. He talks about why that is in view biblically, and of course this is with respect to human beings. He writes this: the Hebrew stem ratzach, as noted by Rashbam and Bekor Shor, these are two rabbinic authorities, applies only to illegal killing, and unlike other verbs for the taking of life, is never used in the administration of justice or for killing in war. Now, let me read that again. The verb here in the command, ratzach, is never used in the administration of justice or for killing in war in the Hebrew Bible. That's a significant point. Also, it is never employed when the subject of the action is God or an angel. God never murders, and his angel never murders either. They never ratzach. This command, therefore, cannot be used to justify either pacifism or the abolition of the death penalty, both of which, Sarna writes, would have to be argued on other grounds. In other words, that's the end of the Sarna quote. In other words, he's saying it's illegitimate to argue, again, for those things, pacifism or to abolish the death penalty, on the basis of this command. You're going to have to do it some other way. And again, I think that's a significant point, to bring up as far as the discussion, because this command does get used in the wider culture for those causes, and they're just not. Again, if you're just taking the verse and you're not looking at any other verses, you're not looking at where the verb is used or not used anywhere else. Okay, then thou shalt not kill. No, that by definition would be taking the command out of context, and that's what Sarna is objecting to. Now he adds an interesting side note that takes us into the social ethical application of the command. He writes, Genesis 9:6 provides the rationale for the prohibition on murder, again, taking an innocent life. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for in his image did God make man. This means, Sarna writes, that society must exact satisfaction for the crime of murder because life, being derived from God, is infinitely precious and is his alone to give and to take. By his unspeakable act, the murderer usurps the divine prerogative and infringes upon God's sovereignty. And because human beings are created in the divine image, he also affronts God's majesty. For this reason, it is not in the power of human beings to forgive a murderer or to commute the death penalty into ransom, as Numbers 35:31 makes clear. Let me read you that verse. He's speaking now of Israelites and those who are going to follow the Torah here. Numbers 35:31 says, Moreover, you shall accept no ransom for the life of a murderer who is guilty of death. He shall be put to death. So there were other commands. We talked about this in the Leviticus series that could be downgraded. Could be the penalty could be adjusted in some way. Murder is not one of those, and it's for these reasons that Sarna is articulating. Now he adds, before we end his quote, in practice, however, at least in Second Temple times, imposition of the death penalty was a rare occurrence. That is also true. It was rarely ever carried out. So we're not going to do an episode on whether the Second Temple Judaism was fudging on the Torah. I think it's fair to say in this regard they were when they don't do this. But Sarna's bigger point is that, look, the rationale for this is rooted in Genesis 9:6, which is pre-Mosaic, and it's rooted in the image of God and God's own authority. Okay, life is from him, and he alone has the authority to give it and to take it legitimately. Okay. Now, Wenham also comments on this. This is the Word Biblical Commentary, and his thoughts echo those of Sarna, but he has a little bit of nuancing in here. He writes, the precise meaning of the sixth commandment depends on the definition of ratzach. This verb occurs just over 40 times in the Old Testament, far less frequently than the more general terms, harag, to kill, to slay, or to destroy, which occurs more than 160 times, and the hifil of the verb mut, cause to die, i.e. kill, which occurs more than 200 times. Ratzach plainly refers to killing that can be understood to be murder, and some translators so render it. But ratzach can also refer to unintentional killing, i.e. manslaughter, as in Deuteronomy 19:3, 4, and 6, and Joshua 20, verse 3. And therefore, it extends to the legal execution of a convicted killer, as in Numbers 35:30. One could therefore conclude that ratzach is a verb of specialized application, referring to killing that brought illegal violence into the covenant community. Such a general understanding of ratzach fits its pattern of usage in the Old Testament. The verb refers only to the killing of persons, never to animals, and it can refer to capital punishment, but not to killing in war. Okay, so there you go. Again, manslaughter, because again, it's not legitimate killing. It's not something that God through the law would sanction. So manslaughter is still an illegal taking of life. But the penalty for that was different than premeditated murder. And again, without getting into all the laws, those of us who have read, through the Torah, know that these things were treated differently. So when it comes to thou shalt not murder, there are exceptions if we understand what ratzak actually means and how it is used and how it is never used. So I think, again, that discussion, getting into the word a little bit, helps us understand, and incorporating the wider context helps us understand what the command means and what it doesn't. Let's go to the seventh command. You shall not commit adultery. Now, obviously, you're going to wonder, what's not clear there? Where's the ambiguity? What could possibly be an exception to this? Well, we'll get there. Now, Wenham writes, again, this is Word Biblical Commentary, and this kind of sets up the discussion. Wenham says, the ancient Near Eastern attitude toward adultery has been surveyed by a number of scholars, and he gives their names. They have commented respectively on texts from Egypt and Ugarit in which, as in the Old Testament, adultery is referred to by the discreet euphemism, quote, the great sin, unquote. The Hebrew verb for this great sin and the verb of the seventh commandment is na'af, to commit adultery. It is used in the Old Testament with both men and women as subject, though far more frequently of men, and by analogy as a designation of idol worship, the violation of the bond of covenant relationship with Yahweh. Great sin, quote unquote, is used in the Old Testament of both those betrayals. That's the end of the Wenham quote. So that's kind of interesting. The Old Testament refers to adultery as the great sin, and the other place that expression is reserved for is idolatry. Again, that's just a really interesting observation. Now, for the purposes of our discussion, and the exception that I've sort of alluded to, we need to understand something from the outset, how the Old Testament defines adultery. I'm going to tell you right now, and this might be news to some of you, the Old Testament, the Torah, defines adultery in a way that we don't. We are actually more prohibitive in this regard than the Old Testament is. Here's what I mean. Here's how the Old Testament defines adultery. This is where you're going to see na'af used, these contexts. Number one, a man having sex with the wife of another man. Okay, I'll just read an example with each. Leviticus 18:20. You shall not lie sexually with your neighbor's wife, and so make yourself unclean with her. Okay, so a man having sex with the wife of another man, that's adultery. Number two, a man having sex with a woman betrothed or engaged to another man. That's Deuteronomy 22:23 through 27. If there is a betrothed virgin, and a man meets her in the city and lies with her, then you shall bring them both out to the gate of that city. And you shall stone them to death with stones, the young woman because she did not cry for help, though she was in the city, and the man because he violated his neighbor's wife. Now, you see there, betrothed virgin is defined as neighbor's wife. Engagement was just like being married. Okay, but the passage continues, but if in the open country a man meets a young woman who is betrothed, and the man seizes her and lies with her, then only the man who lay with her shall die. Again, the presumption is that she cried out. You shall do nothing to the young woman. She has committed no offense punishable by death. For this case is like that of a man attacking and murdering his neighbor. Because he met her in the open country, and though the betrothed young woman cried for help, there was no one to rescue her. So that's different. That's rape, okay? So the key point here is that betrothed woman is defined as neighbor's wife in that passage. So that's two. So how does the Old Testament define adultery? A man having sex with the wife of another man, a man having sex with a woman betrothed to another man. Third, it defines adultery as a married woman willingly having sex with a man who is not her husband. Okay? And this is where, like, Hosea and Ezekiel pick up on the idolatry, the spiritual adultery thing. Playing the whore, that kind of language. So we've got three ways, three elements here, three trajectories that define adultery in the Torah. Now, it should be obvious what isn't included here. What's not included is a married man taking another woman or a series of women to be additional wives, so long as none of them are married or betrothed to someone else, to another man. That's not adultery in the Old Testament context. It's never defined as adultery. The key is, again, whether the woman was married or, again, engaged. Now, this is no surprise, given the patriarchal, polygamous culture into which God inserts himself when calling his people out of Egypt. Okay, God, shows up while they're in Egypt. He had talked to the patriarchs before, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God never tells them, now look, I'd really love to have a covenant with you, but you need to not be patriarchal and polygamous in your culture first. And then we can talk about having a relationship. Then we can talk about me using you to kickstart the kingdom of God. I got to start somewhere, so I'm starting with you, but before I can start, you got to not be polygamists. God never does that. The culture is incidental. God doesn't create the culture. He invades it. He inserts himself into it, and he calls, Abraham. He enables Abraham and Sarah to have a child. He punishes. It doesn't go well when Abraham goes outside the bounds of what God had told him, but taking Hagar at Sarah's suggestion, again, that was a normal suggestion. That's why Abraham doesn't recoil in horror when Sarah, who isn't getting pregnant, says, well, why don't you just take Hagar? Maybe that's what God meant. You have a kid, God wants you to have a kid. He promised you to have a kid, so go take Hagar. And Abraham's like, yeah, okay, that makes sense. He doesn't recoil in horror because it's already part of their culture. But God has to intervene and said, look, this wasn't the point. The point is that Sarah is the chosen one because she is barren, and I'm going to supernaturally enable her to have a child. Okay, so, this is part of the culture. God doesn't create the culture. Well, it's in the Bible. Yeah, it's in the Bible. Lots of things are recorded in the Bible that God doesn't come up with. This is one of them. There are lots of these cultural things God doesn't create and come up with. They just are when God invades the setting, when God enters into the picture. And so you got their descendants down in Egypt for 400 years, and God, calls Moses, the burning bush, and says, hey, I need you to go down there, and I'm going to let deliver my people, and so on and so forth. He doesn't go with a message that, hey, God's really interested in taking you out of here, but you got to get rid of the polygamy thing. Again, it's absurd. But yet we read the Bible this way. They don't have any law on anything until Moses. There's no patriarchal law that's codified. And I know all the Noahide law stuff, where we sort of make up the idea that this gets codified, and it doesn't. There's nothing in the Bible about that. That is rabbinic tradition. And frankly, it's an overread of the Noah passage as well. We did a Fringe Pop episode on that. If you were interested in my thoughts on that, you can go watch that. But we have here a situation where, again, we have a polygamous culture. Patriarchs were polygamous. That's just the way it was. God doesn't bother to change the culture when choosing these men to start anew his plan for people on earth. Now, we get eventually Genesis 1 and 2. Again, I think Genesis 1 through 11 was written or heavily edited much later than the Mosaic era. I've said that many times on the podcast because of all the very explicit and specific Babylonian polemic going on in there. But eventually we get it. Whether it's the time of Moses or later in the exile, we get the ideal. One man, one woman, because that's the reference point for Jesus. When Jesus is asked about marriage, and all that, he goes back to Genesis. So that's the ideal. That's the way it should be. It's the way it should have been. Okay? But, God has to invade human history after not only the fall, but after all three rebellions that we read about in Genesis 1 through 11. He has to invade human history, and he takes it as it is. He's going to clean that up later, but for right now, we need to start a family anew on earth, and that's what we're going to do. We have to start somewhere. I think we just need to read Scripture a little more clearly for what it actually says. And again, God doesn't endorse these cultural elements. He invades them. This is just where he inserts himself in the story. Now, none of that means that everybody, or even most people, was a polygamist. It's not that every man was a polygamist in Israel. We actually, if you really think about it, we actually have very little information on this. It was the norm, for patriarchal culture, and it functioned as a means of social welfare for women, to make sure they were taken care of when their husbands died, because the husbands are the property owners, and the sons and all that stuff, and you have the succession issues. I mean, the women need to be taken care of, and this is part of the way it's done. As distasteful as it is to us, this is it beats putting her out in the desert and saying good luck. Okay, it really does beat that. So it's the norm for the patriarchal culture. It's part of the social welfare system. Once Israel was in Canaan, once you have an urban situation, the need for a patriarchal system isn't as apparent. You just think about what urbanism means for something like middle class living, and you're not dependent on flocks and herds, and you don't need to have lots of kids by lots of wives to manage huge flocks and herds. The circumstances change, but we're just not told many specifics in the Bible about how life was. So we have very little way of knowing how many families were polygamous or not. Our only glimpse into this is with the leadership, royalty. And in such cases, there's the added consideration there, and I use consideration. It's a nice term. I'm not saying it's a good thing. But we have the added consideration of political and family alliances when you get into the monarchy. What we do know is that someone like David had no qualms about having more than one wife, nor is he condemned for it, so long as it wasn't adultery. He is condemned for adultery with Bathsheba, but he has other wives before that. So that's what we know. We have a kind of a spotty picture. Now this leads us to the chief exception for the adultery command in Israelite culture, and that is, yes, generally taking other women sexually as wives as long as they were not married to someone else or betrothed. Well, there was actually a legal institution to do that, and that is Deuteronomy 25, 5 through 10, what we call levirate marriage. Levirate and lever these are Latin terms for what the passage describes. Let me just read the passage. If brothers dwell together, which is an interesting phrase, but if brothers dwell together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the dead man shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go in to her and take her as his wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And the first son whom she bears shall succeed to the name of his dead brother, that his name, the dead person, may not be blotted out of Israel. And if the man does not wish to take his brother's wife, then his brother's wife shall go up to the gate to the elders and say, my husband's brother refuses to perpetuate his brother's name in Israel. Boy, isn't that cutting? He will not perform the duty of a husband's brother to me. Then the elders of his city shall call him and speak to him. And if he persists, basically they're trying to talk him into doing this. If he persists, saying, I do not wish to take her, then his brother's wife shall go up to him in the presence of the elders and pull his sandal off his foot and spit, in his face. I mean, this is a contemptible thing. For the brother to refuse to take this woman as his wife is a contemptible thing. Now here's the question. What if the brother's already married? He's still supposed to take this additional woman. This is the law. There's nothing in Deuteronomy 25 about that lets him off the hook if he's already married. This is a divinely, this is part of the Torah. This is a divinely ordained exception to what we would think is adultery. But the Torah, this is not adultery in the Torah, because this woman has no husband now. She is not married. She is not betrothed. He is allowed, not only allowed, but the law basically wants him to take her and add her as a wife, so that the name of the deceased will not be blotted out. Now, Tigay has some interesting commentary here. And again, I've said before, this is my favorite Deuteronomy. I just like Tigay's commentary. He's a good writer, and he always gets to the point. So in verse 5, he comments on the phrase, if brothers dwell together. The precise force of this term, together, is uncertain. It could mean that the brothers are living in the same family estate, either because their father is still alive or because they have not yet divided the estate after his death. but it could also mean that they are living near each other in the same vicinity. In Genesis 13:6 and 36:7, quote, dwelling together, unquote, means dwelling close enough to use the same pasture land. In either case, this condition is perhaps related to the fact that the offspring of the levirate marriage, the brother-in-law marriage, will inherit the dead man's property. This may mean that in biblical times the marriage was obligatory only if the levirate's home, where the widow and the future child would reside, was close to that property. So Tigay is suggesting, if we take the biblical phrase, maybe if you lived like 500 miles away, you don't have to do this because it's really connected to property. And that's possible. Tigay also comments on the phrase he has no son. The Halakha and Septuagint, Halakha is again Jewish law, Jewish legal theory, and Septuagint take ben, son, to mean offspring, whether male or female. Thus, levirate marriage takes place only if a man leaves no child of either sex. This view is based on reading the law in the light of Numbers 27, 1 through 11, and that is the Zelophehad incident, which implies that a sonless man's name can also be perpetuated if he has daughters to inherit his property, thus obviating the need for levirate marriage. Now, Tigay has a whole excursus on levirate marriage, and I'm going to read a little bit of that. He writes, according to Josephus, whose view is echoed by some modern scholars, the purpose of levirate marriage is to prevent men's households from dying out and their property passing to relatives, and to provide for their widows. Now, let me just stop there. You realize what would happen. Let's say you have a woman, her husband dies, and this happens. I'll put myself into the situation. Let's say I'm the brother here. So my brother dies, and his wife, is just there, and I'm supposed to marry her even though I'm already married. Why? It's so that a stranger doesn't get hold of her, i.e., my brother's property. The property needs to stay within the family, both for the family's sake and also for the woman, because he could basically marry, or somebody could either swindle her, or a stranger could marry her and then divorce her, and then she's toast. She is just toast. She is abandoned and alone. She has nothing. And in this society, women who have nothing are either going to turn to prostitution, or they're just going to die. Okay, they have nothing. There is no government to take care of them. So it's a serious thing for me to look at this situation and say, okay, I'm going to add her, and we're going to make sure that she is taken care of and the property stays within the family, and the children inherit, all that kind of stuff. This is what it's for. But back to Tigay. The practice undoubtedly had those effects, but the Bible's own explanation, as noted in the commentary, is that levirate marriage aims to provide a dead man with a son in order to prevent his name from being blotted out. This is the secondary concern. This reflects the belief, and this is real interesting for those who want to deny an Old Testament afterlife. Okay, this reflects the belief that death does not put an absolute end to an individual's existence. In biblical times, it was believed that dead people's spirits continued a shadowy existence in Sheol, the netherworld beneath the earth, and that the living could assist them in various ways. Many of these methods involved keeping a deceased man's name present on earth, thus perpetuating his spirit's contact with the living. Perhaps the reasoning was that just as the mention of a person's name can conjure up a very real mental picture of him, wherever a person's name was present, his spirit was present. In this respect, a name functioned more or less as an image was thought to function. Hence, in some places, it was the custom to place a person's image or an inscription bearing his name in a sanctuary, thus keeping him before the deity at all times. Conversely, one's enemies could be harmed by writing their names on bowls and then smashing the bowls, just as effigies are used in voodoo, unquote, from Tigay. Now, I've commented on this before about when we get to the teraphim issue. The teraphim were probably, we would call them idols, but physical objects that represented a person. Maybe they were effigies, or they're the akin of our pictures, Polaroids, if you want to go back to the 80s, okay? Why do we have pictures of deceased loved ones around the house? It's because we want to remember them, to sort of quote unquote keep them alive, and also because that at least for most of us, that we believe that they're honored in this way. Why do we leave flowers at a gravesite? Does the dead person like that? Well, again, even though they're dead, we think that, yeah, this is a gesture of respect. The person's looking down on me and all this stuff. Well, the Israelite version of that was to do what Tigay just describes. You inscribe their name somewhere. You maybe make a little representation of them. You keep it in the house. The teraphim were kept in the house. This is why you brought the servant to the house. That the servant, the slave that wanted to join the family, you had to bring them before the family. And the family, the dead, are called Elohim. You had to bring them before the Elohim. It's not the Israelite judges. Okay, if you want to get into this, we spent a whole episode, I think it was episode 109, on this. And there's another one. You'd have to just Google it. But this is the thinking. They're still part of the family. And, again, I realize, again, this is a rabbit trail here, but this is the part of the logic of levirate marriage. You don't want the person's name to die out. The name is going to be inherited by the son of this new marriage, this new relationship. When the brother adds the woman, as a wife to his own family, and then her first son, inherits the name of the father. I mean, this is the logic of it. Tigay adds, levirate marriage is part of the same complex of practices. It provides a man with a son posthumously to assist his father's spirit in ways just described. Given the importance of perpetuating the name of the deceased, it seems likely that the son would not only be legally attributed to the deceased man, but would also take his name as a patronym. Marriage of a widow to a member of her husband's family is also mentioned in Genesis 38. And here's where we get into the Onan incident. It's also mentioned in the book of Ruth. In Genesis, Judah, the father of the dead husband, is still living, and it's his responsibility to ensure that another of his sons marries the widow. The second son, Onan, is unwilling to provide a son for his brother. What he does is he has sex with her and then withdraws, and he, quote, the King James, spills his seed on the ground. He uses her. He doesn't want the responsibility of the levirate relationship. And you notice this is Genesis 38. This is before Moses. This is before the law. This is part of the culture. Okay, this is just part of the culture, and it gets codified in this case in Deuteronomy 25. This is an instance where a cultural element gets codified. But there's a logic to it. And so if I was already married and I was in this situation as an Israelite, this is not adultery. This is adding a wife, okay, in a very specific circumstance. So let's move on. The eighth commandment, you shall not steal. Asarna lets us know again that things aren't quite as simple as they would seem here. Steal, he writes, the precise application of this prohibition is complicated by the lack of specifics. The Hebrew verb ganav may cover theft of chattel or kidnapping. Rabbinic tradition interpreted the command according to the latter meaning. Many modern scholars do likewise. Again, they think that thou shalt not steal refers to kidnapping, arguing that otherwise there would be an overlapping with the last commandment, that in the context of the foregoing items, a capital offense rather than a tort is more likely. Let me just stop there. So the argument to say thou shalt not steal refers to kidnapping is, well, if it doesn't, then this command repeats thou shalt not covet. And that's confusing. So that's why a lot of scholars want thou shalt not steal to refer specifically to kidnapping. Now, Sarna keeps going. He says, these considerations are not entirely persuasive. So Sarna is not on the kidnapping bandwagon. The summaries of the Decalogue's provisions found in Leviticus 19:11, Jeremiah 7:9, and Hosea 4:2 also fail to specify the category of theft that is intended. It would seem best, then, not to define this command so narrowly as to exclude from its scope the protection of property rights. To me, that seems reasonable. Let me read you what Pete Enns says in his Exodus commentary here. He writes, this commandment is developed somewhat in chapters 21 and 22. There's case laws. We're going to be getting into some of those in future episodes. Although the references to stealing are not exhaustive in those chapters, it does give us a framework from which to understand how the Israelites may have heard this command. Stealing includes kidnapping, Exodus 21:16, in addition to taking animals, Exodus 22, verse 1 and verse 12, and material things, Exodus 22, verse 7. Clearly, the Israelites have some notion of ownership and rightful property for such a command to make sense. Stealing from one's neighbor, as with the seventh commandment, is a threat to society. It breeds distrust and strife. Little explanation is given, perhaps because little is needed. That's the end of the ends quote. I think Pete is on the right track here because, you do get these case laws that come up after the Ten Commandments are given, and the stealing, thievery that's described is not limited to kidnapping. It includes other things, personal property. And I think that really helps us here. So I think he's on the right track. It doesn't help us, though, except perhaps, again, to tell us that we need to make this sort of wide because it would have been intuitive to Israelites, and therefore it ought to be intuitive to us. So whatever constitutes theft in our culture, it would seem reasonable to attach it to this command. And I do think that's reasonable. And Wenham agrees. He says the eighth commandment is best understood perhaps as a prohibition of stealing of any kind under any circumstances, unquote. So I would add to that, the commandment has no apparent exceptions, which is a circumstance created by the lack of any precise definition, and we just leave it there. So we have things that we would call theft today that a pre-technological, pre-digital culture would not even have imagined. And what I'm saying is we need to still apply this command to those things, because back in the day, in Israelite thinking, the command was sort of left wide open. It would have been intuitive to the culture. And so that's the way we need to look at it now. Our application of this is based on what's intuitive to us as far as theft, taking property. So let's move on to the ninth commandment. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Now, Wenham makes an important observation here, and one that is perpetually neglected by most Bible students. Let me read that again. Wenham's going to make an observation here, and this is something that I'm willing to say most Bible students, at least the ones I've encountered, don't even think about this, and it's an important part of the context. And I'm talking about preachers, I'm talking about even theologians, Bible students. They hear thou shalt not bear false witness, and they don't even ask, well, is there a context to that? Yeah, there is. Wenham writes, the language of the ninth commandment connects it to the judicial process in the covenant community, unquote. Now, in other words, the bear witness language here is the same as one finds in the Torah for legal proceedings. As such, the context of the commandment is the legal system of Israel. And Sarna has a nice summary of this again. He writes, each individual is here directly addressed as a potential witness in a juridical forum. This is not the same as swearing falsely, for witnesses did not testify under oath in ancient Israel. The purpose of court procedure was to establish the truth on which decisions could be based. The witnesses, whose testimony about the facts with which they were acquainted was always given orally, they constituted the key factor in the judicial process. False evidence not only hindered the administration of justice in any particular case, but also undermined public confidence in the integrity of the judicial system, and thereby jeopardized the very stability of society. As a consequence, various measures were taken to discourage false testimony. 2 witnesses were necessary in order for the evidence to be valid. It's Numbers 35:30, Deuteronomy 17:6, Deuteronomy 19:15, and others. So you need at least 2 witnesses, and false witnesses were punished according to the principle of talion. That's lex talionis, eye for eye. That is, for their mendacious, damaging testimony, they would receive the same punishment that would have been meted out to the accused. Also, the witnesses themselves had to initiate the execution in cases involving capital punishment. That's Deuteronomy 13:10, Deuteronomy 17:7, Deuteronomy 19:16 through 20. That's the end of the Sarna quote. This is a serious business. Thou shalt not bear false witness. Don't give false testimony in court, because if you do, the punishment that was due to the accused is going to fall on your head up to and including death. Okay, that's actually the context for that command. Now, we interpret that command as any sort of non-truth telling or any sort of withholding of information. That is not the context for this command. Neither of those things. Now, I'm going to put it this way. I used to love to do this in ethics class because I think it drives home the point pretty effectively. What this means, consequently, is that this command was not given by God to forbid being tactful. The ninth command does not compel us to provide exhaustive, precise, detailed responses to questions like, do I look fat in this dress? Did you like dinner? Doctor, did my child suffer much before he or she died? Oh yeah, I'm a Christian, doctor. Let me tell you in exhaustive totality what happened to your kid and how much they suffered, because I don't want to violate the ninth command. That's just bunk. Okay, that's just bunk. This is not why the command was given. How about, officer, what do you think happened to my wife? Oh, let me tell you in excruciating detail. Or your kid walks up to you after a game. Did I do good, Daddy? Well, you did okay, but let me just tell you what you did wrong. Because we're Christians. And the ninth command forbids us from being nice, from being tactful. So I'm going to just give it to you in as many ways as I can, just so that we avoid violating the ninth command. Here's what you didn't do good. The ninth command is not given to crush people. You know, we just need to stop it. We need to look for what's going on in context. Now, there's more here. The ninth command was not given for us to produce absurd ethics or assist evildoers in doing evil. How about these examples? When the Christian quarterback looks left and throws right, I'm suggesting he doesn't need to repent. It's the same for the no-look pass in basketball or the intentional foul. It's part of the game. How about, are you hiding any Jews here? Well, yes, sir, SS person, I am. And just so that I don't withhold any information, let me draw you a map in my house to where they're hiding. Because, I don't want to violate the ninth command. Or let me lead you to them so that you don't waste your time or I can't be accused of withholding information. How about the drunken dad comes home and in a rage yells at the kid, "Where's your mom?" And the kid knows that the whole reason for the question is so he can beat her. Well, Daddy, we're Christians, so yeah, I'll tell you where mommy is. Again, this is bunk. This is not why the ninth command was given. A little lighter, are you planning a surprise party? Oh, yeah, here are the details. Gosh, I don't want to withhold any information. Look, this is not, again, I don't, I could just go on and on with these things. But this is how we, and I'm going to say it, this is how we undermine, we destroy this command. We do. These and other circumstances are not what this command forbids. We know this for sure because God himself uses deception to thwart and punish evil. We did a whole episode on that on the podcast, episode 210. God's use of deception to punish evil. Aside from the obvious judicial context, thou shalt not bear false witness, again, the witnessing language, the best way to apply this command is to remember that you owe the truth to those authority structures and partnerships, relationships that God has placed over you and put you in. Things like the government, church leadership, marriage. You owe the truth to your spouse, child-parent relationships. Okay, these are the institutional things that God has given and endorsed and uses and has put you in and put over us. But again, the point of the command is not to compel you to crush people, to crush their spirits and to avoid being tactful. It's about truth-telling that doesn't damage fellow imagers and that doesn't make evil easier and more possible. It doesn't proliferate evil. So let's move on to the 10th command. This is verse 17. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife or his male servant or his female servant or his ox or his donkey or anything that is your neighbor's. Okay. Now, Sarna, again, referencing him, summarizes the difficulty with parsing this command. He writes about covet, this term. A study of the biblical context in which the Hebrew stem chamad occurs discloses that it does not signify the general human proclivity for acquisitiveness, that's acquisitiveness, to acquire things. Rather, it always focuses on a specific object of desire, the sight of which stimulates the craving to possess it. However, because of an inherent ambiguity in the biblical usages of that Hebrew stem and the verb, the meaning of the present command has been a matter of dispute. Action, not just a hidden mental state, is certainly implied in Exodus 34:24. Quote, no one will covet your land when you go up to appear before the Lord, unquote. Yet a decidedly inward feeling is understood in Proverbs 6:25, literally, do not desire her beauty in your heart, unquote. Further, passages like Deuteronomy 7:25, Joshua 7:21, and Micah 2:2 indicate that chamad itself, having a passive nuance, is of sufficient intensity to stimulate active measures to gratify the desire. The issue is further complicated by such questions as whether desire or its avoidance can be commanded or legislated, and whether there can be liability for mere intention or feeling. But this poses no greater difficulty than does the oft-repeated command to love God, to love one's neighbor and the stranger, and to not abhor an Edomite or an Egyptian, or not hate one's brother in one's heart. And that's nice. It's a little bit abstract, so I'm going to read you Wenham's approach. I think it's a bit more helpful. And then we'll wrap up. Chamad is by choice a reference to an obsessive covetousness that could be the gateway to the violation of every other principle in the Decalogue. The 10th command, in other words, let me just break in. The 10th command basically is at the root of violating all the other ones. Wenham writes, thus coveting for oneself the gold and silver with which idols are decorated leads to idolatry, the violation of the first commandment. Desiring the free love of the fertility cults leads both to the worship of other gods and to sexual irresponsibility, the violation of the first and seventh commandments. Yearning after the possessions of others may lead to stealing, a violation of the eighth commandment. The 10th commandment, therefore, I'm skipping ahead, thus functions as a kind of summary commandment, the violation of which is a first step that can lead to the violation of any one or all of the rest of the commandments. As such, it is necessarily all-embracing and descriptive of an attitude, something internal, rather than a deed. It was perhaps set last in the Decalogue precisely because of this uniquely comprehensive application, unquote. And I think that's well said. I would agree that's what's at the heart of the covet command. It is the place where the violation of all the other ones begins. So I think it's well placed and certainly, is pretty devastating in terms of the necessity of circumscribing our behavior, not just our behavior, but our thought processes. It's James, about how sin is conceived and brings forth, death and all that. Now, the rest of Exodus 20, all the way through Exodus 23, verse 20. So basically over 2 chapters. Oh, really 3 chapters. The rest of that, and it stops right before, Exodus 23:20 stops right before the instruction God gives to Moses about sending the angel in whom was the name to lead them to Canaan. All of that stuff up to that point is comprised of a wide description of other laws. The context for those laws will be these first 10, obviously, but there will be laws that are new in the sense of not specifically deriving from these 10, but even those might be said to have a peripheral conceptual relationship to these 10, to the Decalogue. about relating to God and fellow imagers, fellow members of the covenant relationship with Yahweh. And so we're going to jump into those basically in the 3 chapters. I'm going to land in different places in that material. I don't know if we'll spend more than one episode doing that, but that's what's coming next. Some specific sort of case laws, application of what we've just read through in the Decalogue. And we'll tackle, again, not everything, but some of the things that are interesting in that material as we keep going through the book of Exodus.
Mike, I just got a quick question about the structure of the Bible. Why not in chapter 20 there? Why start with the laws of the altars in chapter 20 rather than 21?
Oh, as far as like interrupting the Sinai sequence?
Yeah, why just to break up the chapters, why wouldn't they put start with the laws of the altars with chapter 21? Why is it on the end of chapter 20?
I'm going to combine a bit of the thinking of that last comment about the 10th command, about how it's the springboard or the starting point for the other ones, with something we talked about in the last episode the first episode, part 1. If this part of Exodus, is more clear when the Decalogue is given in Deuteronomy 5, there it's really clear. Exodus 20, it's less clear, but there are those who argue it's still here. If this is all set up as a covenant ceremony, a covenant event, then the laws need to occur in a certain place in the structure of how covenants were written. Now that is, again, I'm confessing that's more evident in Deuteronomy than it is in Exodus. But there will still be those scholars who argue that this is why to our eye it looks interruptive, but it's actually following covenant formula, for the whole wider event. Once they get to Sinai to when the Decalogue is actually given, it's put in that place because that's where it belongs in the covenant ceremony kind of thing. So it's a little odd, again, to our eye, but I think that's probably it's a reasonable reason. The other one is if you recall from 2 episodes ago, that they're situated here because not to interrupt the theophany necessarily, but to precede the case law that comes. But in my mind, that doesn't answer why you get here at the end of Exodus 20, which we didn't read. You get right after the laws, it picks up, with the scene. Now, when all the people saw the thunder and flashes of lightning, the sound of the trumpet, they're still at Sinai. So the second explanation to me doesn't explain as well the interruptive nature of this as well as the first one, because essentially, if you're following a covenant formula and people are reading it that way, or it's read orally, literate people in the culture are going to know why it is what it is, even though it's really foreign, to our ear and to our eye. But I think that's probably the best option.